last because I can just amplify that. But the flip side of not getting your candidates to, and this will happen sometimes because we had, of course, this is our first year. And so we did have some candidates that campaigned on repealing ranked choice voting. The way it works in Alaska, a citizens initiative is untouchable for 2 years, which means after enactment, which means that as of February, which, you know, just a few short days ago, the legislature could repeal the whole thing. So one of the difficulties we had is if your candidates don't believe it's simple, or sometimes maybe even if they do, they'll tell their voters, oh, this is complicated, but let me explain it to you. And so that's why I think it's so important, as Jean's saying, is about making sure those candidates really understand how simple it is, right? And so that they're not telling people right away. If you tell someone it's complicated before they try it, then they're just going to believe that that's the case. But I think one of the things that we ran into a lot, we did a lot of mock elections. I went to a lot of churches and town halls and civic centers and all of that. And you would always have 1 or 2 people, most of who I knew, that would say, well, I don't like ranked choice voting and it's not one man, one vote. And I don't understand, you know, it's so complicated. The person who loses can win, all of the kind of the misperceptions. But you have 30 other people in the room that are trying to learn about ranked choice voting. And so I think one of the things that I learned early on is it's incredibly important to validate that somebody has an opinion, but not get bogged down in your election efforts for the 29 other people in the room on arguing the merits or the misinformation at that time. And so people would say, well, I've heard it's not one man, one vote. And I would say something like, well, that's, you know, the courts have, you know, I understand your concerns. The courts have said, upheld this meets one man, one vote. And what we're going to do today is we're going to try doing an election. So let's all get out our mock election ballots and just make sure everybody understands that. And we'll save our philosophical discussions for the end so that we can make sure that everybody here, you know, gets a handle on how to vote their ballot because it's coming up in a couple of months. So I think that you know, there's always going to be people who don't like it. There's always going to be reasons to not like it, valid or not. And I think that when you're looking at the voter education portion, you have to keep that in mind, like take the wonkiness out, right? Don't discuss why ranked choice voting and getting that majority vote is so important when you're trying to educate voters on how to actually fill out the ballot.
So one thing the 3 of you have in common is you've all worked impressive numbers of candidates on a ballot in the year. We have the 48 in the special primary in Alaska. Shout out to the 35 we had in 2013 running for mayor, and I don't even know in New York. That was crazy.
515 that were on in that election. Yeah.
Not one race.
No, not one race. Citywide, 515 that filed.
And these were both for single offices, and then Sean had everything going on. But all of that is to say, a lot of candidates have now run under these systems. And so there are, I think one of the biggest developments we've made through the years in these efforts is realizing sometimes candidates can feel untouchable. It's that C3, C4 line of, is this lobbying? What can I do? And I think as a community, we've decided we have to educate candidates. So I'm interested to hear what approaches you found have been effective in engaging candidates and how you're able to navigate keeping them truthful about what the reform is. Gina, as the pioneer of candidate training, you can kick it off.
And Grace was a part of that. We realized after the first election that candidates who needed more. They were getting some information from the city, they were getting some information from us, but boy, digesting it and campaigning, understanding it, they're 2 different steps. And so we knew we needed to go deeper. So in that big candidate election year, the open mayor's race, 35 candidates, the good news there is that like 90% of the voters voted for the top 6. Right, they understood those were the people who got the debate stage, etc. So once they understood the field, they knew what to do. Trust the voter. It always works out. They trust the voter. So what we did was we're also from the land, not just of Prince, but of Paul Wellstone, you all know Paul Wellstone. And it is in the wake of his passing, there was a training program called Wellstone Camp for candidate training. And so we worked with them and partnered with them to build out a candidate training program around ranked choice voting. And then had them in for 2 days of training and role modeling and practicing and how to ask for second choice vote and how to build out a a voter outreach model that was inclusive of not just first choices, but second choices and third choices, and how to message about that. The first thing a candidate always learns is setting that window. Well, when it's 50% plus one, it's already easy, there's the floor. So then how many more votes do you need to, how do you build up that coalition to get to that 50% plus one? And we have seen candidates who digest and understand the process best, do best in building that coalition. Again, what always is hardest for us in any community is if a candidate says vote for only me and don't vote for anybody else. It is the worst. And by the time they start down that road, it's really hard to pull them back. So we try to make sure they just don't go down that. So the earlier the better, the candidate side. I'll just give one example. We had a special election in a largely a Somali dominant community, and it was a race among many Somali candidates. And there were just a mix that were making that a practice of voting for just me. It was really hard to pull that back at the end of the day. We did our best, but we knew coming out of that next time we're gonna make sure that every candidate will like have someone track and shadow and coach and handle so that doesn't happen. It's really harmful to voters and the voting community when that happens. So we try to prevent that with the candidate training, and over time it's becoming more successful that candidates are really on track to do the right thing. And it was very rewarding. In the 2017 election for mayor was another very competitive mayor's race. We knew that the candidates were actually enjoying the process a lot. They were telling us that. Win or lose, we knew that they valued the opportunity to run under ranked choice voting because more candidates could run. Under the old system, it would have been down to 2. And everyone else would have been excluded, but there were good 3, 4, 5 other very competitive candidates who said, I would not be here in this general election if we didn't have ranked choice voting. So what we tested was the opportunity to bring all of them together after the election in a press conference to talk about the value of the process, winners and losers. And they did that. And that just spoke volumes to how much candidates, not just voters, were beginning to embrace this model. Many candidates go in thinking, oh no, I just don't want to learn how to do this. But come out saying, amen to that. And then they become our most important evangelists in the process to let other candidates know that this isn't just going to be okay, it's going to be that.
Well, if you could talk about New York, I know that's where you started as candidates. That was the bedrock of that education program. So you can talk a little bit about how you designed that and built it out.
Sure. So for a full year before we even started talking to the public, we just trained candidates. So we had around 350 candidate trainings. Our candidate trainings were 2 days. They were about 9 hours, between 7 and 9 hours in training. A lot of it was what Jean came up with and loaned us, and Grace came up with and loaned us. And so we kind of intertwined all of the resources that were out there and available for folks. But at the end of the day, what we found was candidates who did not talk to their voters about ranked choice voting lost. And so it's interesting, a lot of times they blame ranked choice voting and say, I lost because ranked choice voting exists, but no, you lost because you didn't talk to your voters about ranked choice voting. And so they did not include you in their rankings, or they didn't rank and their votes, you know, once you lost the race, didn't go to someone else. And so you did a disservice to your community by not talking to your voters about ranked choice voting. So it's very important, I think, very early on, going back to one of your previous questions, when you talk to voters, I will say no more than a month before ballots go out, quite honestly, because voters are worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about getting to work, being able to afford gas to get to work. They're worried about pocketbook issues. They're not thinking about, oh, how am I going to complete my ballot and do this electoral work? 2 or 3 months out from election day. They're just not thinking about that. So you need to catch them when they're starting to think about the campaign, and quite honestly, that is usually less than a month before election day. It's more usually once they get a ballot, but there still has to be some leeway there, but.
That brings up one thing that I think we've all worked to do, which is sneaky voter education. Getting it in under the radar. You don't even know you're being educated, right? So it's finding those places of partnership where someone already provides a community service, right? And we just happen to be like, well, what if you ranked that? Or like, what if you added this simple little lit piece to that? I'm wondering if you can cite some examples of what you've done to do the sneaky voter education in those partnerships. Julie, do you want to start?
Yeah, and I will echo a few of the comments, and I earlier you asked about the timing, and I agree that when you're thinking about how do I educate voters, that they need to be ready, right? They need to be thinking about elections. But those civic organizations, those endorsing organizations, think about lobbyists, think about people who actually campaign for a living, right? Before they sign on those candidates, they're gonna want to know how to navigate that system. Because we had a, like, if you build it, they might not come situation when we did candidate training where, our candidates were like, I'll give you an hour, I'll give you 45 minutes, like poor Grace, like was talking to staff, they all stayed, then we also gave them lunch. But, we had a hard time getting our candidates to actually come to the training. I didn't care, I was a pest, I sent them everything anyway, because then I'd done my part, and I always get a tiny little thrill because Santa wrote me a letter. I mean, it was actually an email, but I was glad to get an email from Santa. He is, by the way, huge ranked choice voting supporter. So he and I email now back and forth. But I think that getting those endorsing organizations, getting those campaign consultants, getting the people that train the candidates, parties, like getting that information out to them as soon as you can is important, so that way when their candidates are ready for that training, they can be like, oh, you know what, you need to call and get on that candidate training, because that was really beneficial. Because we found that once we did one, people wanted more, but they were like, I don't need to be trained, like I've campaigned for years, right? And so getting kind of the people that talk to the people trained early is a really good idea. But I don't know if I'd call it sneaky, but one of the things that we did was we mock electioned everything. Like I sent out, I'm like, if you're having a book club, let's do ranked choice voting where you're like, let's learn how to ranked choice vote. Like we have Fat Bear Week, and we have, there's so many things, like we want to talk about fair food. Let's ranked choice vote the best fair food. And so one of the things that I tried to get my team to do was I'm like, I want everyone to have ranked so much stuff by the time the election comes around that it's like the ranking itself is pretty self-explanatory. And so I think I can't even remember, like anytime there was a public event, I'd say like, hey, do you want to rank anything? Like we'll give you things and you can give them out and you can rank forefront. We ranked United Way, we ranked what they thought the most popular, or not popular, what the most needed community program was. And the nice thing is that, and then we provided that stuff to United Way, and we pulled names out of the hat and they got a $100 gift card. So, we didn't, United Way did that for us, and we weren't bribing anyone to vote. But just having that option available, like I just said, you can call me and we'll set up a ranked choice vote for whatever it is you want. So yeah, mock elections are fun. We did Sour Patch Kids because they come in a little campaign, what do you call it? A little candidate debate already. There's 5 of them in a little thing, and you can give them out and people can rank them. We did a reading thing with kids, because when the kids are ranking, their parents don't like to admit that they can't rank. And we had actual ballots on iPads, and the kids would rank. And my 14-year-old daughter was teaching 5-year-olds to rank. So we just tried anything that could be ranked, we ranked.
Your 14-year-old could put us all out of a job on voter education. But I know Sean did some really cool innovations with how to partner and deliver voter education in unexpected ways.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that coalition of 750 organizations we built. We were doing this coming out of lockdown. So in New York City, lockdown was lifted May and the election was in June. So we essentially had a month in which we had face-to-face contact with people. So we had to think very strategically about how we hit hard to reach communities that weren't on Zoom. So seniors, people where English wasn't their first language. And so one fortunate thing through the pandemic, or at least being at the tail end of shelter in place, was there were all of these delivery services. You had Meals on Wheels, you had the food banks, you had the public libraries, that were all doing deliveries to people who could not go outside. So we were able to partner with Meals on Wheels and provide them materials in 15 different languages, in large print as well as in regular fonts. So that anyone who got a delivery from Meals on Wheels got RCV explainer, just a one pager in the language that they spoke, delivered to them. The public libraries did the same with their book deliveries. But the one that I thought was the coolest was actually we did a training of all of the Starbucks employees and management in New York City, in the New York metro area. And we were able to do a mock election with them. So in some stores, but all of the managers and employees of Starbucks went through the ranking process. So ranking their favorite Starbucks drink so that they could then be ambassadors and talk to their communities and the people who visit their stores about RCV.
Amazing. Did you train them on your order on that ranking ballot? I'm sure they knew. Having ordered for you, you trained people on. A rite of passage at Fair Vote Minnesota is working a full day at the state fair doing a fair foods ranked ballot. So, but Gina's done a ton of innovating in this space as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I love your ideas, we don't smart that, that's a good one. Yeah, any opportunity to rank is a good opportunity, there's no goal space on anything, and that's so to your point, Julie, just pick an opportunity that you're engaged in and find a way to rank. We do them weekly at this point, daily, of course, during an education campaign. One of the ways that was super effective for us, now this was during the campaign year, so we wanted to reach people in a couple of different ways outside of voter education, was asking restaurants to actually put ballots out so customers could rank their options. So partner with restaurants and other organizations to put something on the ballot and they can educate their people. So we thought that was a really fun way to do it. And of course, the state fair is our biggest day of ranking. People love to rank their fair foods. And the only problem they have in our software, people doing the rank your vote things, is that it doesn't allow for that writing, because they always want to tell you what their favorite is. But they actually take it very seriously and always make their favorite foods.
So you have technology for that now, because it was paper ballots when I was. All right. So I didn't know it would be easier.
I just want to add, so the mayor of New York did a mock election of ranking your favorite pizza topping. It was a one-day election. They gave people 24 hours to vote, and they had over 1 million people vote in that process. It actually crashed the app, rankedvote.co. It crashed their app for a few hours, but they got 1 million New Yorkers to rank their favorite pizza topping. Yeah.
That's another good idea.
Wait, what one?
Of course, but
No matter what, it cost us scandalous.
right, yeah.
Yeah, talk to that hasn't go well. So one theme that's come up in a lot of what we've been talking about is messengers matter, right? Who's talking to folks, how we work around sometimes, how we work directly sometimes. And I think there's nowhere that's more important than when we engage with the media. That's, we talk about candidates being the front line. Right behind them are the folks writing about this, tracking these elections, having those conversations. And it's an essential relationship, but it's maybe one of the hardest. I go back and forth between candidates and the press. So I'm wondering how you all engage with the media and how you maintain, Sean was talking about everyone speaking in one voice. How do you achieve that when there's all these different stakeholders?
Well, what we typically do in any election cycle, and we've learned this over time, the communications with the media are essential, just like for candidates, is that we push information all the time. We don't wait for them to come to us and ask how does this work and what's it all about. They usually write that all up, it's all wrong, and then we have to go back and fix it. So we want to make sure that they're speaking the right language from day one. So as soon as we launch our voter education program, we send out a media advisory to all of the media and make sure that they know that there's a ranked choice voting election happening this year. This is what it's going to look like. here's who's all on the ballot, these are the races, and here's all about ranked choice voting. If you have any questions, call us. And then we do reminders, anytime there's an opportunity to provide an update, we do it. So they probably get at least two communications from us a month to all of the people in the local media, including the ethnic media communities and in different languages and so on. So we want to make sure that we're communicating with the media a lot. And sure enough, when they say, oh, it's time to write about ranked choice voting, they'll communicate with us. We don't expect an immediate response because they're not focused on that. It's not timely for them. But when they are ready, they know who to call, and that's what we like. And it's different in different communities. Minneapolis does some outreach to the media as well, which is always great. Not everyone does that, but we encourage the election officials to also send those communications so that the media knows that there's information available through the official channels.
Julie, what was your approach to that? I mean, it's a massive state and there's a lot of rural voters that need this contact and that's the primary way. How did you approach kind of getting folks to get that message?
Well, and on the media front, I mean, the thing about Alaska is, you know, we only have a handful of media folks. So it was I think a little easier for us. We had they like to be smart and they like to write the right thing the first time. They don't like to do. So we actually kind of had an open sort of ask any question, no stupid questions, right? Where we invited, I think we had 2 of them based on, so one for the larger media and one for smaller folks that we had some experts online and allowed them to kind of get a good briefing. And you see kind of that pay off now. And we actually have the reporters at our biggest paper, pushing back on, now that there's a repeal effort, some of the misinformation, because we gave them a good grounding months ago about things. And so they'll call sometimes to get, oh, what was this again? But for the most part, we just did a lot of our homework up front with the media folks said, hey, what do you guys want to know? How do you want to know? Let's connect you with, people that know that not us, that we're the advocates, but, the right messengers. And I think that when you talk about voters, as the press, it's the same thing. So we also had not quite so many partnerships, but we did partner with, Get Out the Native Vote. We partnered with people who are going to be in that community anyway, making those messages accessible. And my goal was, when I took over, I said, I want to find a person that everyone's going to listen to anyway and train them, right? So if it's the post office in this village, or if it's the bar in this village, that's the person we want to train. Because the thing is that they're not going to call Julie and find out about ranked choice voting. They're going to go talk to, Sam down the street. And so we just need to know in all of these, because a lot of our, we have 3 big cities in Alaska, and we have, thousands, like most of our communities are under 5,000 people, and they're not accessible by road. Right. And so we're not going to get everything out to, I think we sent out one huge mailer, but we're not going to get to everyone. So it's just a matter of finding, like, who's the person that holds that opinion? Is it media? Is it, somebody that was elected before? Is it the postmaster? Like, who needs to get that and then make that accessible to them?
Sean worked in a tiny media market, not much going on there in New York City, just a couple papers.
I will say, never underestimate the impact of a great media consultant, press person. In New York, one thing we did was a training. We did a training for the press. It was on background. It was purely the process. So that when they were talking about ranked choice voting, there was kind of this uniform messaging of, this is the process. This is how ranked choice voting will work. But also shout out to Deb. She and I did an article in our story in New York. It was something like 57 or 63 questions on ranked choice voting. It was some absurd amount. And it was purely just going through, okay, these are all the questions we've ever received on ranked choice voting for our publication. How do you answer them? And so answering literally every question that comes before you and being able to answer every question that comes before you is important.
Next.
It's like a 3-hour interview.
So we talked about in the policy discussion how advocates don't always have control over that, right? We can do the best that we can, but sometimes decisions will be made that are outside of our control. Maybe, for example, the number of days it's going to take until you get results. Look at these 2 especially, that can have some effects. I'm wondering, how big of a problem do you think that is when you have these wait times or you have things like that? What is the impact on voters? Is there one? And how do you approach that? I'll start with 15 days. Right
Yeah,
here.
so, I will say the one good thing, was that we already had a race. We, in Alaska, we have the 15-day waiting period has always been there. Division elections have never certified for 50 days. The thing is that what the division elections chose to do for ranked choice voting was only make first choice results available. So that meant that nobody could kind of game out where second choice votes were, because that wasn't part of our bill or part of the law. That was a regulatory decision that Division of Elections made for reasons that they thought it might be too confusing, or they, whatever reasons that they had. So what we tried to do was we did a lot of public information about why, and I think Dylan talked about that a little bit, like why we wait, right? We wait in Alaska because rural votes don't come in 3 days. The statute says if it comes in 15 days after elections from there's different for different pots of people, but we have overseas military, we have some overseas voters, we have rural places where even after 15 days, I think there was a handful of ballots that didn't come in from precincts because they just can't get to the hubs, and then they just can't get to the Division of Elections office. So some of those second place votes were actually never counted because they just didn't get there in time, and that's a whole chunk of things that were received by election day in their area. So one of the things we really tried to do was start out early. We knew it was going to be a problem. We talked to the Division of Elections. They said, well, that's the decision we're making. And so we said, okay, we're not going to continue to try to convince you to do something different. We're going to work with that decision and support you in your mission by explaining to people why we wait. So we had a couple of different campaigns. We had a military person talking about why their vote is important. We had some rural Alaskan representative from rural Alaska talking about why that vote was important to wait for. And just it was a whole why we wait campaign. We still are getting hit with the 15-day waiting period. Some people are still saying, ranked choice voting caused us to wait 15 days to figure out who's going to win anything. But I will say that there's, having that talk with the media ahead of time, when people make that claim in the news stories, they say, except that's not right because it was that way before. And the fact that we had one election decided by a coin toss and one election decided by one vote from an ex-felon in the last 5 to 10 years, that was kind of fresh in everyone's mind, kind of helped with that story, right? So we would, when we told the press, would say this was existing law. Here's a couple of other times where we had to wait more than 15 days to find out about elections. Elections in Alaska, sometimes you just have to wait. And I think that we all expected it after the first election, after the August election, to be a huge concern. And the blowback we got from voters was actually really minimal. Some of them using candidates are very upset about it. And there are some candidates that are pushing that, like waiting for 15 days was excruciating. But I think by and large, inoculating the press ahead of time, letting voters know this is already existing, letting voters know this is coming. All of our pamphlets, everything we had said, election day will be this date and results day will be this date, right? So everything we had was telling them there is going to be a wait. We will all know this is just part of the process. I think really tamp down that temperature.
So that's 15 days. Sean had 7. How did you navigate that? How did you prepare people?
So I think part of it is letting the press know and making sure that they understand this is not because of ranked choice voting. This is because of vote by mail, which in New York City was very new. The process wasn't new, but the number of people who were voting by mail was. By example, in the most recent open mayoral race, there were about 3,000 vote by mail ballots that were cast in that election. In the most recent mayor's race, there were over 130,000. Because the pandemic opened up vote by mail to a wider population. And so that process takes longer to count because New York has very strange election laws. I can say that because I'm no longer in New York. But they have to do things like you can't open the ballot, just even open the envelope of the ballot to like sort it and put it in order and verify signatures. You can't do any of that until the polls have closed. And so then there's a window on top of that for how much time you have to let, if there's an error on the ballot, to let someone correct it, and so you end up with a 2-week window for counting vote by mail ballots. New York also has this thing that they put all the data on a flash drive. The flash drive can only hold 100,000 votes, and then you have to take the flash drive from one side of a huge hall to the other side of a huge hall. It's just very strange processes. But all of that adds time. And they have a fairly small election staff. So when I mentioned that 130,000 votes, it's not like they're opening all of those envelopes on election night and having it sorted. No, they're doing it in batches of about 5,000 at a time. So it takes a much longer time to be able to count those. And that would be true under any system. That's not because of ranked choice voting. We all in this room know ranked choice voting is done by algorithm, and it's like hitting a key on a keyboard, and it's done fairly quickly. But it's just the additional processes that are attached, many of which are good. We want to make sure everyone has access to the ballot and access to vote, and we want to make sure that every ballot is counted. So all of those are good things, but it adds on time to the counting process.
Well, Jean, I know some of the cities you work in, lightning speed, and others different, but how do you navigate? I mean, really, how do you set expectations for voters, candidates, the media? How do you have those conversations?
Two things. One, communicating with the media is important, and what we have, we set into our process a series of expectation memos, we call them, out to media, just to make sure that they're following their expectations in the way that we want them to, and they're very, very important, because not having the right assumptions and writing about that is where voters are always going to get tripped up. It's funny what we learn about regular elections and shine in our cities spotlight. All these things that happen in elections and always did and always will, but now all of a sudden it's all about RCV, right? So we get that blowback all the time in Minnesota. Well, the county, it's gonna be 2 weeks. No, it's not. Aaron's going to talk to you about the way that Minneapolis does its tabulation process, and it's very exciting. When we started out in 2009, it was like the second city after San Francisco, and it was just, or Oakland at that point. And we didn't have the processes. So there was a long manual count of many, many weeks. Well, when that horror story got over, Minneapolis said never again, are they going to do that? And they got it down to 2 weeks. And that was because we had a long mail ballot, it kind of took that many rounds because we still didn't have the tabulation software. But clever Minneapolis, as it is, decided, well, we're going to mimic what software does in a spreadsheet system and do it manually, and now it's next year. So we love to tell that success and that immediacy of the tabulation results now, especially in comparison to where it was initially. But it's important to keep in mind all of these time delays that happen because of RCV or because of something else. We get over them each and every time, and it has never really stalled the movement. That's not been a deal breaker in any of this. We get over those conversations by being communicative, by being ready to answer questions, by making sure candidates and campaigns and media who are concerned about that have access to information to help them understand that. And we've managed through that as a community of activists and reformers through each and every one of those phases. And I think we'll continue to do that. And as improvements get made, they're just good success stories to say, yeah, now finally the technology is catching up. And that's why ranked choice voting is the most rapid growing reform across the country.
Well, I don't want to hog all the questions. I know we may have some from the audience. So Dave's going to ask you some that we got on from our cool QR code.
Thanks, Grace. We've got some great questions today. And a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you QR code in the middle of your table. But get things started. The RCV space is still very white, technocratic, and UT separate from racial justice issues with communities of color. What efforts might change this?
How do we want to start? We go right to left, right? I mean, it's part of education work. It's a central piece of it. So let's start with Julie and then move on to Pam.
I think from our perspective, and again, I am new to this space, but I will say that when I came in, my goal personally was to, like, I felt like, we'll train the candidates and they'll train the super voters. And then there will be all of these people that only show up every once in a while that maybe aren't their top priority. And so this has to do with all of the partnerships we did. So we partnered with, we tried to partner with anybody who would partner with us, but we really concentrated on trying to find those underserved communities that we felt might have English as a second language. We did the seniors, we did something similar. We send out, our food bank sends out a box once a month to seniors who maybe aren't on the road system. And so we put a pamphlet into there. We worked with the Alaska Justice, they used to be the Immigration Justice Project. I know they changed their name, sorry, I should know their name. I can't remember the acronym. Right, I know the acronym, but it's, but they translated it into a lot of different languages. We worked with, we tried to get it translated, just all of our stuff translated into as many languages as possible, but more than that, we tried to partner with people in those communities again. So we had, we have a big Samoan community, so we partnered with somebody from there that, like, their nonprofit, I think, was probably days old. I mean, they're still developing, and I went to their, we broke bread with them, well, it's more rice, but we had, a nice meal with them, and just trying to get out to those communities and try to educate and translate and make sure that it was being passed down by people who were culturally, not just linguistically changed into their language, but also make the education culturally relevant to those pockets of the community.
Keep going down the line.
Okay, harsh reality. This is probably the most diverse room of RCV advocates I've ever been in. Which is great, but also not great, right? There's a lot of work to be done in the space to make it more welcoming towards different folks. And part of that is being a good partner. Oftentimes, we only care about RCV. We don't care about anything else in our movement. And we have to be good partners. We have to be there working with environmental justice organizations. We have to be there working with social justice organizations. We have to be there working with voting rights organizations. And not just working with them on RCV, but working with them on their issues. And so I think we have a long way to go in this reform space, but I think we'll get there.
Oh, well, I echo that completely, and I think that's just generally true about coalition building in general, because that they are, all the organizations that are in a coalition are the ones working with voters, but it's also where candidates come from. So I think the reason why this question is so important is not just about making sure voters are educated and have access and information about how to vote. It's about empowering communities to be represented and having candidates run through communities. And those are the partnerships that we strive to develop all the time at the local level to make sure that people are running candidates from their community, having an opportunity to campaign in an effective manner and win. So I like to say always ranked choice voting first changes who decides to run, who can run, how they campaign, and who can. And just having the story of Congresswoman Mary Peltola be such a shining example of that opportunity really helps us understand the power ranked choice voting gives to more voices and the power that it gives to communities to have candidates run under a different, more open and inclusive system. And when that is known, it really changes the equation about who wants to get involved in this kind of movement, why that's important to them, and how this is going to grow moving forward.
One thing I'll just add there, and I can say this probably more than you all get since you work on the ground a bit more. Oftentimes when we're implementing, we are answering for the sins of the campaign that passed ranked choice voting. If you didn't build a representative coalition, we have an advantage of inevitability with implementation work, right? This is going to happen. We have to make sure that communities that may not have been engaged in the campaign are included in education, but we should not have to do that. So I'll make that stand here of you should build the coalition before you pass the law. You should get the buy-in before, right? Because if we're building power, we need to be building it the entire time. And so we're good at what we do. You all are incredible at what you do, but it slows us down if the table isn't already built by the campaign itself. So I encourage any of you who are advocating, look around. Make sure that the room isn't homogeneous. Make sure that you have different kinds of organizations coming to the table. The beauty of democracy work is it's the intersection of so many issues, right? You can care about so many things, but if the system doesn't allow you to take action on it, we're all stuck. And so I encourage any of you who are advocating, use that in how you build these campaigns and do that work before we have to apologize for it.
Can I add just one thing? I say this to folks all the time. There's a difference between winning and winning the right way. And oftentimes in this space, we are so focused on winning that we don't care how we win. And the biggest obstacle that we face as a movement is not along partisan lines. Quite honestly, it's along color lines. Because this movement has not done right by communities of color. It's been other people coming in saying, this is how you should operate, this is how you should be governed, and like it or not, we're gonna do this. And we can't afford to do that anymore.
What about the second cycle with RCD, with the third or the fourth, there may be less money, less high profile races, media attention, et cetera. How do you keep the momentum going?
Julie's paying extra attention on this. We'll start with you.
It's an excellent question, because we think of, well, we just started up and then it will have its own organic way to really just happen each cycle, and it's just not true. And I'm glad to see more money being put into voter education, outreach, and communication as each cycle happens. So Minneapolis is now on its 6th cycles. They do every 4 years. Other communities every 2 years. The reality is, ranked choice voting is used primarily in places with a lot of change and growth. At least that's where it started. And so we're going to see new populations in the community all the time. They're pretty used to the regular, or pretty used to knowing the normal voting system or the traditional voting system, but maybe very new to ranked choice voting. So we always are doing education and outreach because there are new people in the community and we want to make sure they're aware. It does get a little bit simpler over time because now we have a base of people who do already know. But of course, with campaigns and candidates, starting with them, most of them are new, and we always want to make sure we're in front of them. So my recommendation to all donors in the space is keep the money coming for voter education outreach. It is the one thing that we can tell elected officials and others we need to work with in order to move this forward, whether it be a city council level or a charter commission or a state legislative body like we're working with now in Minnesota. When there's a promise that there will be resources for outreach and education, it's a game changer. It means it won't just happen and be thrown out at people. We're investing in making sure people understand and have an opportunity to be as empowered by the system as it promises to empower voters.
Again, I think Jean is a great example of what should be. I'll let California again be an example of what should not. And so in San Francisco, we've had ranked choice voting for nearly 2 decades. In Oakland, where I live, we've had it for over a decade. There was a strong education campaign done when it was rolled out in both of those cities. Since then, not so much. And you've had a major population shift of folks who were there 20 years ago or 10 years ago, not being there anymore. And so there has not been a lot of continuing education done. And we've seen communities become more vocal because there's not that continuing education. Also in Alameda County, which includes 4 of the 5 RCV cities in California, they decided to change the number of rankings from 3 to 5 without there being any education done around that. And while that seems like to us maybe a simple change, it's not to voters. Any change needs to be thoroughly explained And there has to be outreach done to those communities that need that extra touch. So I would encourage, as as RCV ages in your cities, that we continue to be at the forefront of doing education at every level.
You're coming up on yours. Do you have any thoughts?
I guess, yes, ask me in 2 years. No, one of the things that we tried to do is create evergreen materials that were non-branded. And I think that, well, because we knew we had the money now and we don't know if we're gonna have the money in 2 years. And so that's one of the things that we try to do is just make sure that anything that we create now, that can be used next year, and to keep those, we keep talking about coalition building, right? To keep those relationships, like I'm still reaching out to my folks. I mean, obviously, we're still pretty new, but I think that they have a vested interest in making sure that their constituencies are educated as well. And we are also advocating, for more legislative funding for the Division of Elections to continue doing election work. So those are kind of steps we're taking. I'll let you know in a couple of years how that works out. See?
All right, question for Julie. What are some particular education programs that work for universal mail-in elections as opposed to in-person voting?
Interesting. So we were really scrambling. I'm not sure how well everything worked. We were really scrambling for our first vote by mail election because it happened everything happened so quickly. That timeline for that special primary was incredibly quick. And so that was the only election that we did. We actually did a mailer to every single household that had a registered voter in it. And we kept the messaging incredibly simple because we weren't sure if people were going to be getting, what they were going to be getting. So we, again, switch it back to voter centric, right? We weren't talking about ranked choice voting. It was a primary, but it was the first election that they had vote by mail. So we said, you have to sign, what was it? Put it in the envelope, sign it, have a friend sign it, mail it by this date. Like we didn't, fill out one, vote for your favorite, right? And then it's kind of where we coined that pick one primary because the reform was final four. And so everybody was like, which four would do I just pick my top four? And so we had to say, no, so pick one primary, sign it. And so I think that that's kind of the difference is for the in-person, if they had a lot of stuff on the walls to tell you how to do ranked choice voting, they had, people there to help you out. And so we really tried to, with our vote by mail stuff, just keep it down to exactly what you need to do to make that ballot valid without getting too wordy and without, too much extraneous stuff, knowing that people that would be going to the polls would kind of have that backstop of the poll workers. And also, when you put our ballots in, if there's an error, you get an immediate message, if you're at the polls and you don't get that. We don't have ballot sharing, which is kind of the sort of things that we're kind of looking at, like Jean was saying, like you learn about all the deficiencies of your system when you're implementing a new system. So that's something that we're kind of looking at how to help with that. And so we just wanted to make sure people got it right.
Oh, and I'll add to that. I mean, the most effective tool for education is the ballot. That's everything. And we love when any community will send out a real sample ballot to every single voter. That's expensive. It's not often done, but it's probably one of the most effective things an election body can do.
All right. I think this next question was given with the new Portland, Oregon adoption in mind. So for me, what does education look like specifically around proportional RTD for multi-skill?
Someone's in the know here in this community. Minneapolis Spark Board, and we have another independent board called the Taxation Board, uses the transferable vote form of ranked choice voting. And with equal success, you guys, we rank 1, 2, 3, the education on our end is just the same. Rank your preferences and your ballot's going to count the way that you want it to, and we keep it really short and simple for voters. But we also have a pitch, and we make sure that people understand the reasoning behind the opportunity to elect up to 3 proportionally. It gives it's more representative. More voters are actually helping elect the candidates who are elected. So real simple, powerful messaging on why proportional representation is advantageous and not something scary. We don't get into the tabulation behind the scenes, but when asked, we tell them pretty straightforward. They go, okay, that's fine too. It is a real opportunity. So as we expand ranked choice voting in Minnesota through our local options bill that we hope to pass this year, in addition to a path for statewide ranked choice voting. We'll have more and more opportunity in communities, both in school districts as well as the city council, because most of them are not split up to 3, 11, 4, or 5. So we'll see more and more of that opportunity moving forward, and we're hoping that Portland really is a good example that can show us why that is a really good way to vote on elections.
How do you balance being a good partner to voting rights groups, et cetera, with not alienating Republicans or painting RPD for the right issue?
Well, that's we did it successfully. Well, here's. So we, it's interesting because I wasn't part of the campaign, like I said, I'm kind of, I came on the education effort and I'm staying on to help against, fight against the repeal, but I wasn't part of the advocacy effort at the beginning. And so when we really turned a leaf, like we leaned into our 501c3 over the past year, and we're basically just advocacy light, facts heavy, right? And we actually ended up hiring for our consultants, one of the people that ran a campaign against ballot measure 2 when it was on Orange to ballot. And it was specifically for that reason. It's matching that, matching the person, the messenger, right, to the group. And our thinking behind that was twofold. One, if everybody gets the ballot wrong, we're dead in the water, regardless of how much certain people like ranked choice voting. So when we thought about how do you educate everyone, even the people who don't like ranked choice voting, we said, who's the trusted messenger for them? Oh, it's the person that ran the campaign against ranked choice voting. So it was a limited contract. We didn't ask them to advocate for anything. We said, you can go out to these more hostile areas, just do the facts, make sure people know how to vote. You don't have to talk about the philosophy. Here's the, here's just the basics. And I felt like we got a lot of people educated that way. And we did have, while there are still a faction of people who don't like ranked choice voting and that didn't necessarily work with, I think that really from a pure of heart sort of education standpoint, we really wanted everyone to be able to fill out their ballot. Like the system works when everybody votes their conscience. So even if you don't like ranked choice voting, if you vote your conscience, that's still going to work. But we did have somebody who was, as I was saying before, we went to all of these town halls, and there's this one person that really disliked ranked choice voting that always stood up. I mean, I knew him, so it wasn't surprised when I saw him. I'm like, okay, I'm ready for it. But after the election, he put out a tweet or a Facebook post, I can't remember, that basically said, hey, people like this. Like I learned a lot about it during this process. And so I think we kind of thought about it as there's no opportunity if you don't include them, but there is opportunity that people might like it if they learn it simple, if they do it right and they experience it. And so that was kind of how we tried to open the door.
I think you have to do what's right for the community that you're working with, right? Quite honestly, in my experience, which has been in more blue areas, there is a party that does not like ranked choice voting, and there's a party that's more open to it. You have to decide what works best for the movement that you're building. And so remember, not all voting rights organizations are super lefty. Not all environmental organizations are super lefty. And so I think you partner those that are aligned with the values of your organization and the movement you want to build. It's my best advice.
I think Sean's point is that this really has begun in larger cities, and so the impression takes on pretty quickly that it becomes something much more receptive there and less receptive outside of there. We need to break through some of that by giving experience in a broader range of communities. It's great that Utah is really a leading state on this issue. It really, I think, helps others understand the value of doing that. And we're going to see it come to a bigger test when we take these statewide initiatives. When they're done at a local level and the community is predominantly red or blue, then we don't get to see that cross-partisan nature as much. But taking it statewide, we do, and that's why I think Alaska is such a good example of showing that coalitions are going to be built on a bipartisan basis. It's just the nature of the beast, and in places that are not block, gold, red, or blue, you're going to have a mix of those votes in order to win. And that coalition building is going to happen in that case. Expanding ranked choice voting in Minnesota to suburban communities now. We've got it, 3 suburban communities, 2 of which are, have much more politically mixed, voters. And we have seen candidates now win with Republican votes. They're probably still Democrats running, winning, but they wouldn't have a coalition of votes alone just within their own partisan voting box. They had to build broader coalitions. So that is the value of seeing this used in different kinds of political communities to help over time break down that partisan narrative that this movement has.
I will, if I could add just one tiny, I think that it's helpful, the examples that we had in Alaska, because we did have, we had Republicans win, and we had 3 districts that were, that flipped, right? And 2 of them were Republican districts, where we had 2 Republican candidates, and instead of one spoiling it and the Democrat winning, a Republican won the race. And so when you look at our statewide electorate, where they elected, a very conservative Republican, moderate Republican, and a Democrat, I mean, hopefully that will show Republicans that conservatives can be elected under the system as well.
One thing I'll just add there, I have been yelled at by people from every part of the political spectrum when talking about these things, but I've had the same aha moments with those folks too. And the key thing is what Sean said, values. There are so many values that are the reason we do this work, right? Fairness is one of them, right? The belief that you can build community power if you engage. There's all sorts of things. So one thing I encourage you to do if you're doing this work, get in touch with why you're doing it first. Get those values, get a hold of them, because when you're getting yelled at, you're really going to have to remember that to not leave the room. But also, it's going to be the thing that gets you to the other side. Julie knows that there was one particular happy hour that I was not very welcome at, but I was instructed to go, and it was with a group that did not want me there, who really didn't agree, who made some assessments without asking very many questions, but that's fine. But by the end of it, we were having the same conversation because we found common ground without talking about things where we didn't have it. But we really found what those values were and got to the other side. And so the issue somebody works on, the angle that they're approaching this from, the beautiful thing about implementation work is actually none of that matters at this point, because what we need is for voters to cast their votes effectively. And if you have a constituency that you work with, I want your constituency to vote. So do you. Let's work together.
And I'll add one more thing there. It's we just did a recent poll. We really wanted to understand in Minnesota as we advance it statewide just how familiar and supportive voters are of this. So we took the risk of doing a poll and it came back favorably. And the extra good news about that poll, it showed basically we're asking a very direct question. Would you like to use ranked choice voting statewide, partisan primaries and general elections in 2026? Like it wasn't just generic. And 54% without any more information said yes. That's really powerful. We got that response because of the familiarity there is with this issue in Minnesota. It is about familiarity. It's about becoming educated. It breaks down those misconceptions pretty fast. With a little bit more education about ranked choice voting, that support climbed to 64%. So it just shows once again, once you educate people of all political stripes, they like ranked choice voting. The survey was done among about a third of Democrats, third independents, third Republicans. There were differences across party lines, but not like you would think. In fact, more than 4 in 10 Republicans said yes to that question. Far, far ahead of the legislators represented. Voters are with us, and I think we need to always do better to help translate that voter support and sentiment and desire for this to our legislative.
So I'm sure there are more questions, but we are going to have to wrap pretty quick. But we will have a break after this. So you can run up to whoever you have the question for. But I wanted to take a little time. I'm going to switch hats really quickly. So here's my educator hat. I'm putting on my sort of advocate hat, even though I'm not really. But I know all of you are in your ways, or at least there is still work that you're doing. There's really important stuff going on. And I want to pause and ask you what's going on now, what's next, and how can people help you out in your efforts? So I'm going to start with Julie. We're going to go down the line.
So I don't know, this might be an impolitic or really politic thing to say, but Sarah Palin's keeps on giving, right? So, so right now, you know, she was our governor for a couple of years and then she had some national fame and then she came back and ran for US Congress and there was a kind of nasty campaign and now is spearheading an initiative repeal effort. And so that's kind of where, you know, where we are now. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, Alaskans have just experienced it. We passed by a very narrow margin in 2020. And so I think that we have a real, even though I feel like a lot of the concerns that they have about ranked choice voting, when you look at them, you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so when you get down to like the policy calls that seem to be the concern, it has to do more with the open primary, which most Alaskans like. We still have a fight ahead of us with the repeal initiative effort. Fortunately, even though the legislature could repeal it, we don't seem to have a lot of a fight on that end because we did, I mean, we have coalitions under the, currently we have a big coalition in the Senate that they got elected under ranked choice voting, they like ranked choice voting, and enough people in the House that like ranked choice voting, even though some of them campaigned on repealing it, that there's not, I don't see that being successful, but yeah, so that's what we have in front of us now is their signature gathering for a repeal initiative to be on the 2024 ballot, and if I'm not.
Help them fight if you can. Sean.
What you called me earlier.
Sean, all of the Johns you are.
Yeah, so I wear many hats in the RCV space. One of which is as the consulting executive director for the California Ranked Choice Voting Coalition. So there we actually just had a victory at the ballot box last week. Where voters in Redondo Beach, California, kind of in the LA area, voted by almost 80% to implement ranked choice voting in their local elections. So we're moving into the implementation phase of that. We are pushing 4 cities to have ranked choice voting on the ballot in 2024. And gearing up to kind of increase that visibility until we have a statewide ballot initiative, which is a very expensive process in California, you know, probably $70 to $80 million for that campaign. Additionally, I am the founder and president of CORE, which is a collective of organizers for reform elections. And CORE's mission is to bring seasoned organizers of color into the reform space. And to do that by providing training and resources and kind of a support network, as well as having conversations with grass top leaders of color around democracy reforms in general. So lots going on.
Yeah.
Jean. Yes, well, boy, do I wish we could do a statewide ballot, sure. Our poll just showed it with. We can't. And it's hard work getting it through the legislative process, but we're on it. It's very exciting. So we had one hearing last Thursday in the Senate, our first for the elections committee, and passed out of committee. So we're excited about that progress. And then our next hearing is this coming Friday. Congresswoman Mary Peltola is coming to testify in person. Oh, she's a star. You would not believe the attention this is getting. So we're hoping that it's going to get a pretty smooth sailing out of that committee as well, with her presence of the lieutenant governor, who's also an indigenous elected leader in Minnesota. It's very exciting that we have her coming to Minnesota. And then the path will be through a couple of more committees before it goes to the floor for a vote. We have whips to and we have votes to whip up in both chambers still, so that's the work that we're doing. And we know that if we get this bill to the governor's desk, he's eager to sign it. So we have a real path to getting it passed. What does that legislation look like? The local options bill that will come into effect immediately. So any jurisdiction that would want to do it that now can't would have the power to do that. It sets forth regulations to do that. It then establishes a task force that would develop the standards and procedures for how this would work on a state basis and the timeline for implementing that process. And that's important because Maine and Alaska coming before Minnesota had a fairly centralized approach to administration. So the Secretary of State can really do that. But we have a lot to kind of figure out in that administrative space how that process would work. So we'd like that process. We like the task force built into the bill. And making sure that it does its work in a timely and efficient manner with the right stakeholders around the table and put that timeline in place. I mean, it could be as early as 2026. It could be after that. That would be the determination of the task force. So it's a great bill. We're eager to get it passed. How can you help? Of course, if you know anyone who knows anyone in Minnesota, make sure they're contacting their legislator. It's our #1 action call to make that happen. And then promote this whole thing in social media. It's like, oh my God, this is exciting. This would be the first legislative victory. When Minnesotans see that they're being watched and have a spotlight on them, they get all excited. They can continue to lead the way and let's get this done. Attitude is everything in this, right? There can't be any momentum busting steps along the way. We always have to just keep building that out with high expectations, and that's one big way you can all help.
So people who do voter education, often our goal is not to get applause, it's that we don't get booed. So I would appreciate it if you would give them all the applause that they deserve. And then we have a short break, probably a bio break, and then head back in here and you get to hear about the wonderful world of election administration.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Okay, so 10 minutes-ish? All right, perfect. 10-minute break and we'll see you back here. Thank you all.
There are these snacks and drinks that you pass. Waiting a minute.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah.
Hi, Grace, Kevin Hancock, how are you?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That was great. That was fantastic. So thanks again. I think you're fine. It's great to be here.
And they're really.
Perfect. Yeah, we have some folks out, who work for companies.
Yeah.
Some work with companies, so glad to know that they're together, talking about this. Yeah.
It's not my report, so I'm just having. Yes. Yeah, I'll just because they're after what I'm doing, just in case there's any. I was gonna say, I was doing this. Oh, then you switch to the- Oh, so we're back. Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Okay, so don't count then. One makes something.
It is the only way.
Everyone can take their seat. Gonna go ahead and get started with the third panel. Everyone can take their seat. Thank you, Ellen. That's why we have a team here. We apologize for a little bit of delay. We had a little bit of internet connectivity issue. I'm sure none of you have experienced that in the last 3 years in any way, shape, or form. So appreciate your patience. We have panel number 3 that's moderated by Ryan Kirby, who is from the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. He'll introduce his amazing panelists, and I'd like to invite them out now.
All right, thank you everyone for being here, and I know I'm standing in the way of happy hour, but I think this will be a good conversation. And as you can see, we have the biggest, and I'm gonna call the best panel of the evening. So my name is Ryan Kirby, I'm Public Policy Specialist at the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. To my left, we have Whitney Pressenberry, the Director of the Center for Civic Design. Then we have Delegate Sally Hudson, who is the delegate for District 57, which serves Charlottesville and the Virginia House of Delegates. And then we have Chris Hughes, who's the Director of Policy and General Counsel for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. And then we have Aaron Grossman, who is an election administrator for the city of Minneapolis. So we'll go ahead and get started with our icebreaker question, which I know everyone is dying to know the answer for. So what would your walkout song be? Start with that, Aaron.
All right, well, Gene, also from Minnesota, took the Prince song, so I could go Bob Dylan route. That's a little bit cliche. I was thinking about, we start our ranked choice voting tabulation the morning after election day, so I gather a team of people who have just worked an 18-hour day, and so I'm contemplating playing the final countdown. Listening, so I'll go with that.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I finally realized this afternoon that it's Dance Yourself Clean, an 8-minute long song by the LCD Sound System.
So as one of the many people that is in this room and has been working toward ranked choice voting adoption before lots of other people thought it was possible, I'm gonna go with Billy Joel, You May Be Right.
I'm gonna just show my age and political heritage and say it's gotta be Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land.
Nice. So can we start off with talking a little bit about how you got into the ranked choice voting space, and we'll go reverse order this time. So with you to start.
I got into the ranked choice voting space because we did a little flash test and we saw people having a lot of problems. And we went to Fairwood and said, there's a lot of problems with ballot sign, and they said, no, we got this covered. And 6 years later, they came back and said, maybe we need some best practice on ballot design. And so we started talking to a lot more voters, but some time had gone by, and I've gone from neutral skeptic to to advocate, not so much on the theory, but just on listening to voters say they get it.
So I think I encountered ranked choice for the first time as a high school student reading the book, The Radical Center, which came out of the think tank space like this. It was about big ideas that could change the world, but had no shot of actually getting adopted. I used ranked choice as a voter in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when I was there as a student, but I got into the advocacy space in Virginia as somebody who wandered into my local Democratic Party meeting after Donald Trump's election, feeling like ranked choice was the practical solution to the problem that we've found ourselves faced with, and having a bunch of people tell me there was no way you could do that in Virginia. And my reaction was not with that attitude. And so put one foot in front of the other at the Grassroots Advocate, ended up running for the state house in Virginia because I decided that if nobody was going to carry the bill, I would, and have since been an active legislative advocate and now on the implementation side.
So going into law school, I knew I wanted to do either international human rights work or domestic election law. I couldn't make up my mind between the two. And then as I was applying for jobs out of law school, saw a posting at Fairvote for a legal fellow, applied to it, got it, started working there. And then a year later, I think Drew came to me and was like, what do you think about election administration? Do you want to do a project about running ranked choice voting elections? I said, sure, because it's something I know nothing about. And now, 7 years later, I have written or helped co-write an 80-page booklet baby that you're all here to talk about. So that's how I got here.
Well, I was working with the city of Minneapolis Elections and Voter Services in 2017 for our municipal election and was on our tabulation team. Thought it was a lot of fun. We have a spreadsheet based system that we use for a number of reasons that we may discuss later on. But I thought that was great, and I was working with the city elections department. My main program area is running our in-person early voting, which begins 46 days before election day. So we really have 47 election days. Sometimes we say in Minnesota. And then in 2019, I was informed by my supervisor, also you're going to be doing ranked choice voting, not just participating in it, but let's coordinate everything as we gear up towards 2021. Of course, as Jean mentioned earlier, we had a special election that we weren't quite expecting in 2020 with an open council seat. So that was a really good test run, kind of similar experience to Alaska for me, just kind of seeing the process from start to finish for that election, and then was able to lead our team in 2021. And now looking forward to our 2023 election, which is this kind of weird one, council only because of redistricting in Minneapolis. So always elections.
So we're here to talk about technical implementation. That's probably one of the areas that we suspect advocates probably know the least about when it comes to a campaign and ranked choice voting. So Sally, can you talk to us a little bit about the legislative process and how you brought election administrators and advocates together and what happened in Virginia?
Sure. So I think that there can be a chicken or egg problem in trying to expand ranked choice voting in any state between the lawmakers and the administrators. Because the administrators have their hands full, especially in an era where there's a lot of election reforms going on, automatic registration, same-day registration, early voting. And the administrators don't want one more thing on their plate, and I don't blame them. And the legislators don't want to pass anything that the administrators aren't ready to carry out or that they don't already understand. And so how you break that chicken egg tango is, I think, what it takes to get the project done. I remember carrying a ranked choice bill in 2020 for the first time when I was a freshman legislator. And it was after Democrats had just secured a trifecta in Richmond, and we were doing all the classic voting rights reforms. And so the election administrators felt like they were completely overwhelmed. And the pushback against the bill was, we don't have bandwidth for this right now. But managed to put together the legislative coalition to pass a very narrow local option bill that said you can do it at this local level, only for city councils, only for county boards. And then once we got that through, COVID hit. And not only did that turn most state agencies upside down, but especially election administrators who were trying to figure out how do you get all these people to safely gather in a place at a time where congregating in one location is hazardous to everybody's health. And so we kind of tapped the brakes on RCV implementation because we knew we would just sour our alliances with administrators if we tried to push them to do anything more than they were already completely overwhelmed to do. So we didn't really make much more progress on ranked choice in Virginia between 2020 and 2022, when it felt like the administrators were finally getting their feet back under them from both post-COVID elections and also all the other voting reforms that we passed. And the next big step in breaking that chicken egg problem was having a locality that was willing to file its ordinance, even though they weren't quite ready to pass it. Because the act of having an ordinance to discuss is what spurs the administrator to say, oh, we actually have to get ready for this. And we have to be capable of answering questions from local city councilors. So I think we owe tremendous gratitude in Richmond to Councilor Catherine Jordan, who was willing to file a formal ranked choice ordinance for city council adoption in Richmond, even though she understood that we didn't quite yet have the votes on Richmond City Council, because it got the state board of elections to start investing in some of the administrative details. And so that vote, that ordinance was ultimately defeated, but it's impossible to overstate how much good ground that ordinance cleared, because it got the state going on the nuts and bolts, and it teed us up for Arlington County to have a successful ordinance passed at the local level this fall. They will be using ranked choice for the first time in a state-run party primary in June of this year. So I think figuring out what the forcing event is that gets people working, recognizing that when administrators have too much to do and not enough resources, doing anything that's not yet real and imminent is never really going to rise to the top of their list.
That's really helpful. And Aaron, from the election administrator perspective, Minneapolis has used RC for several cycles now. What's kind of that relationship like, and then working with advocates like Gene Massey, who we heard from earlier?
Yeah, I'd be happy to provide our side of things with Jean, which I think she represented quite well. It's really important to have those relationships with advocates in the community. Most election offices, ours included, is relatively small, especially just counting full-time staff, kind of expansions during the election season. But even in an office like ours in Minneapolis, which prioritizes voter outreach and education, that's nobody's full-time job, or rarely is their full-time work. And so providing that information both to advocacy groups and candidates, the press, is really important to have the consistent message that voters receive so that they know what to do when they vote. And we can leave all of the back end and logistics things for later. Something that we've done periodically is invite any of those groups to just come to our office and walk through and see the machines and maybe put a ballot into the machine themselves, even just to have that feeling so that they can be credible as they're talking with voters, and not just from a theoretical or this is how I understand it, but you can say I've done this. And so whether that's trying out a sample ballot or sitting down with me and kind of walking through the tabulation process, even if they're not ever going to do that same process with a voter or another community member, just having that exposure, I think, has been really important for how we built over time with Ranked Choice Minneapolis.
And then Whitney, can you talk about kind of bridging the gap, because you're not an advocate, but you work with election administrators. How does that work? And talk about some of what happened in New York City.
Yeah, so we think that we're the center of a Venn diagram. The advocates know we're working with the election office. The election office knows we're working with the advocates. Sometimes we're used to essentially carrying messages. But we like to say at Center for Civic Design that we're nonpartisan, we're non-profit. We're also policy neutral. Not that we don't have opinions, but that election offices often don't get to choose what they get to implement. And so we're there for them. We actually have a pretty good track record of working in red states and working in places where law changes have been forced on the election office, and sort of helping them find a way through that will nonetheless serve voters, which is what we're really in it for. I do want to say something that I haven't heard in this room yet, which is what's happening right now in election administration across the country. Not only are there reforms being implemented, there's an awful lot of trauma in that industry. I have a friend who's an election officer in California who gave a talk, it's podcast, where they were talking about scenario planning, and they said, well, what's an example of a scenario you didn't have to do before all of this? And she said, well, we never have to plan for me being shot. Right, and that was a real possibility. And so I think when you think about how you're going to work with an election office, you have to think about an office that started out stressed and is now sort of beyond stress, that we're losing staff all across the country. That means we're losing expertise. It means that they're paying, and this is a world which in the words of the title of the movie, there really is no time to fail, and they can't fail. And so any way you can position yourself so that you're part of the solution rather than just banging on their door will be better. So that takes me to New York City. Sorry, I'm not to answer your question. We started working on our city in New York City planning in late 2019, because in New York City, the Campaign Finance Board is actually responsible for the voter education and voter guides, not the Board of Elections. So it's a split administration. They knew that this was big. They also had a fantastic voter guide, but a fantastic website, but it had been around for a few years, and they brought in someone new to kind of shake the whole thing up. And she said, I want to start from the ground up. And we started doing sort of very open-ended user research with people about how they wanted to get information in the first place. Began testing things. We learned stuff about how many touches it takes for them to start to feel comfortable. A series we call Bite Snacks and Meals, that a little bit more that they adopted and built into their website. But that meant that we went into that with pretty strongly tested language on top of the stuff that came out of the best practices guide that we did with Fair Vote and our CV Research Center, which were also pretty well tested. We had done testing in language, in Spanish and Chinese. The usability testing or the research testing that we did in the first couple of rounds was entirely non-white, based on contacts through their community board, advisors from the community, mostly young voters. So we were already right there from the beginning, reaching out into the community And not, you know. On our very first project, we were told that if we made it 10% easier for people like us to vote, that project had failed. That we had to be reaching new audiences and helping them, so we carried that in, it served us well. That led to collaboration with Common Cause, which led the coalition table, got to know Sean. That led to us getting invited into the BOE, where we got to review pretty much everything that went out. We couldn't fix everything, but we got to review everything and made some important differences in things. We'll talk about some of that later. But I think we basically just did it by being perfectly honest about who we were and what our position was, so they didn't have to guess, and being willing to hear them say no. And know that sometimes we would talk to them a lot about what they ought to do the next time, because this thing they didn't have time to completely redesign. It was going to press. The other thing that happened in 2020 is that we redesigned the New York State envelopes, and those had actually worked very well for the BOE. And so we came in with a lot of credibility. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, I think that leads in to my next question for you, which is about training and education. When you're working with election administrators, what are some of the things that they need to know that are the same or different for when they go to educate voters?
I actually think it's everything the last panel said, but the last panel also said something about neutrality that's really important. Every election office believes that their job is to be a neutral provider of information, and where they draw the line on neutrality will differ. I mean, Minneapolis was sort of very pro RCV as it came in. Grace did a great job in actually implementing it. Other places are like, our job, if their city council is divided or their commissioners are divided, they may not be as willing to express a pro or con opinion in how they do it. And so they sort of fall back on just facts, right? So they fall back on that. The other thing is to remember how much more they have to do in education than just voter education, or even candidate education. There are thousands of procedures to be adjusted, to be tested, to be run. And in New York City in particular, it's actually 5 counties. There's 10 commissioners. Working for 2 is hard enough. Working for 10 must be impossible. I can't believe they've kept an operations director for more than 6 months. So there's that. I think the other thing to remember is that in the end of the day, it's their name in the newspaper. They will get blamed for everything that goes wrong. They might get some credit for things that go well. And their jobs are on the line, right? So it's sort of an existential question for them about their professional career and their professional standing in their own mind, and making sure that you're sort of acknowledging that, you know, CCD, we hope that everything we do goes really well with them, but if we don't, there's the next project you want to. And that's a very different place than a local advocate who's still going to live in that community, or from an election office who's going to still live in the election office. We haven't talked about languages, cost of printing, and what happens about translations. I think there are a lot of issues. We got told, for instance, that in New York City, they would not bold words on the ballot. In fact, they won't bold words anywhere because some of the languages that they support don't include the concept of bolding. And they want to make sure that the languages are treated as initially as possible. I gnash my teeth, but I'm glad for the principle, right? So there's trade-offs there. The other thing is that no matter how much voter ed you do, they own the 100 yards around the polling place, and that's flat 100 feet from the check-in station to the voting booth. And I think that's just golden territory, and anything you can do to help think about what people need in that last 100 feet as they're walking. And I'll show you something that New York City did that I thought was great. We've already talked about they're doing less candidate printing. If we have any advice, especially when there's multiple city agencies involved, it's that consistency absolutely matters. Everything we know about low civic literacy and low reading literacy and ESL audiences is that when there are small differences in the description of how you do something or what it is, it stops them in their tracks because they start trying to figure out what those words mean. When to a native English speaker, they're really synonyms. We don't care about the difference that much, but if you're not sure, and if you don't trust the election office that much, or you don't trust elections that much, it can just be the little chink in the crack, and chink in the wall. If you have too many of those chinks, then you start to get doubt. And the other thing is to look for places where you can complement their work. or where other agencies can complement the work. Someone mentioned the mayor's office in New York City. They came in quite late with some funding. And they were gonna do another mock election thing. And a number of us convinced them that what they really had to do is language-based communications on the secondary audio channel, language radio stations, because no one was touching radio, and radio is a huge thing in New York City. Right, so helping figure out what's not being covered gives them a chance to shine, and it gives you a chance to be smart.
Awesome, that's really helpful. So my next question is for Sally. We talked a little bit already about candidate education. And so, you're an elected official, you've run campaigns and won campaigns. When ranked choice voting has already been passed and you're running for office in your ranked choice voting election, what is some information you would want to know as a candidate?
So let me find that this is an abstract question for
Yes.
me, because I've been on the voter side, but I haven't run in a ranked choice election. But I think if I can channel some general themes that are true about candidates, is that they're first and foremost overwhelmed, especially for down ballot offices. Remember that most of us are running to serve in part-time jobs and holding down another job while you're running to serve in a job that might pay you like 15 grand a year, right? And so if you're already trying to figure out how do you manage just the normal part of being a candidate, I think the most important thing you're going to want about the ranked choice component is confidence. Like you want to have that battle tested language so that you don't have to be reinventing the wheel about how you talk about ranked choice, because you're already trying to figure out how do you own your own message and how do you get people's very scarce bandwidth for down ballot elections. And so I think that that's the biggest piece, is that you want to be able to hand them something that can be pretty off the shelf so that they can talk about the ranked choice piece in a very straightforward way, so that they can spend their time focusing on the part about how do they earn your vote. I think the other piece that would give a lot of candidates some questions, at least, is how to really talk about being someone's second or third choice without ceding your perceived primacy. Like, how do you really talk about saying, I think I should be your first choice, but if I'm not, I would like to be your second or third. And it's something that I think is a little bit of a delicate dance, because on the one hand, you want to be confident and you want to talk about why you really do think that your vision is the best for your community. On the other hand, you recognize that coalition building is a really important part of what you do. And so how do you strike that balance? I think is something that candidates would appreciate a lot of guidance about, so that they can hit both notes well.
So when it comes to kind of some of the nitty gritty of technical implementation, I want to pivot to voting systems. So my next question is for you, Chris. Can you give some advice for advocates who might want to understand a little bit more about what voting systems are and how it might impact their process trying to get your interest voting?
Yeah, so I'll start by talking about what we even mean when we say voting systems. There's a lot of different technologies used to run elections. There's voter registration databases, there's result reporting tools that everybody here is probably most familiar with, the stuff you see on elections websites when you're trying to figure out who won and what's happening. But when we're talking about voting systems, we're talking about the stuff that's in place in precincts where voters who have marked their ballots go to scan those ballots in. We're talking about the software that election administrators use to design ballots and program those machines to accurately record ranked choice votes or whatever other sort of voting method might be on the ballot. So that's what we're talking about with voting systems. Those voting systems are sort of like the backbone of American elections. They're the thing that make it possible for us to have 40 or 50 different contests on a single ballot that voters get to vote on, because Americans elect an absurd number of offices. There's something like 1 million elected officials in the United States, which is, a lot of people. That being said, that makes voting systems extremely important to running a ranked choice voting election. You need voting systems that can capture ranked choice voting data, that allow voters to mark a ranked choice voting ballot, that allow election administrators to design a usable ranked choice voting ballot. And so that is both before adoption and after adoption, one of the most important questions election administrators will have, and something that advocates need to be sure they're ready to engage on with those administrators, because voting systems have a wide variety of ranked choice voting capabilities. Some of them, especially more modern ones, can capture ranked choice voting data. They export what's known as a cast vote record. It's this ranking data for every ballot that allows you to produce ranked choice voting results. But older equipment, stuff that is thankfully now getting phased out, but still isn't phased out everywhere, that older stuff can't capture the same kind of data. So you need to, as an advocate, need to go into these conversations with administrators during the legislative session, after adoption, understanding what the capabilities of your voting systems are. The best way to do that is to look at our website. We have some reports that we call RCV maps. They're state-by-state assessments, looking at the voting systems used at the city or the county level in every state, saying this city, the equipment in this city can do ranked choice voting. This is how good it is at doing ranked choice voting, essentially. Or this county, this city can't do ranked choice voting. Here's what you need to do to remedy that. I think the other important thing to keep in mind, and I know Whitney will want me to mention this, is it is expensive and complicated to replace voting systems. Getting the hardware is expensive. It happens pretty rarely, once a decade at most. There's lots of states, Connecticut, for example, that are using 20 or 30-year-old voting equipment now, and they desperately need to replace it, but it's expensive and hard to do. So it's hard to build the will to do that. So if you need to be replacing hardware as an advocate, you need to be ready to find the funding for that, fight for the funding for that for your elections office, if and when the time comes. If you need a software update, which most places probably will need some kind of software update to get ranked choice voting, that's still going to be an appropriations fight. It won't be as big a number as getting hardware, but it's still an appropriations fight. People hate spending money. They apparently really hate spending money on elections, which is perverse, but the world we live in. So you need to be ready to have those conversations and be clear-eyed, I think, about what it actually takes to get the resources to your elections office to upgrade their voting systems, among other resources they might need.
Can I add, believe Chris faster than I did, because I remember the first time Jean hit me over the head with this conversation and gave me a rundown on the voting systems thing. And I was like, that sounds way too weedsy. I'm in this fighting the big policy battles. And then it took 2 or 3 times of coming back to that as the bottleneck before I really accepted that that was the part that I had to bite off. And Chris took me to school on all of that. So he's right. And you can be faster than I was in accepting it.
How can I make the argument better? What else do I need to say?
Because election officials are often unwilling to stand up and say, I can't do this, right? I mean, it is their job to do what the legislature says that they'll do. So it's hard for them to say. I watched them struggle through some hideous situations. There's an entire C4 initiative for getting enough money in elections to run elections.
Let me illustrate that. This conversation with one more point. If I'm at a gathering or conference with election officials, kind of your standard icebreaker, somebody from a different jurisdiction is like, oh, what voting system do you have? It really doesn't matter what the response is, but it's going to be met with a groan because they all have their advantages and disadvantages, and people have those experiences or perceptions and things that they're familiar with. And then just to add on to what Chris explained so well, not only do those systems vary in what they're capable of, but the standards that they're tested against may vary state to state as well. And so they're trying to tailor their products for 50 states or more in some circumstances. And dovetailing that with RCV is an additional challenge, and why you might you may not find a very receptive audience if you go to your election administrator and say, and point at Maine or point at Alaska and say, they did it, so we can do it here, without uncovering some of these challenges that might come with voting systems or other state laws and regulations.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing those points up, yeah. So we'll kind of pivot to ballot design. So Whitney, I know Whitney brought some handouts which we're going to pass out right now so that we have a visual to help the technical implementation.
It's a while to do that. I just want to talk about the very first thing. I think Chris was with us in the Streets of Tacoma Park, where we took a sample of existing ranked choice voting ballots out and without changing them at all, sort of had people try to mark them. And the results were pretty sad. But I've been working by that point for 10 years on federal voting system standards for ballot design. And we thought, well, we're trying to figure out what layout works better, but we have very different quality of design. And so we had someone redo all the ballots to the same national standard quality that the AIGA and EAC had adopted. And this miracle happened, which is that once you started to make the ballots look better, that is big enough text, spacing around the marking targets, all of those things that are just basic good information design. This miracle happened and people started being able to focus on who they wanted to vote for and how they wanted to think about ranking instead of where's that tiny little dot I'm supposed to do what with, right? And so that's the basis of everything. And one of the things that's happened in the last 2 to 4 years is that the major voting systems now either can or are ready to be able to actually support real ranked choice voting in a way that they just weren't at all. So the debates over whether we wanted 3 columns the way Minneapolis started doing it or a grid were sort of irrelevant because your voting system couldn't do the grid. It didn't matter whether grids were better or not. So we were a little slow to say one of them is definitely better than the other. Other thing I want to call your attention to is on the bigger piece of paper, there are 2 sets of instructions for voting because instruction, we talked about ballot being that last mile, being the last chance there. Which of these 2 sets of instructions do you think are better? Anyone?
We needed Japanese music while they were reading.
I know the people in this room have.
Number 2, so they're both written in statute. New York City put in their statute in quoted language, all the language has to be there. Everything in the top, and you can see from the picture next to it what it looks like when you put 3 languages together. They actually decided to do 2 English, Spanish +1 for the 5 languages they support. Because when we tried to put 5 languages on it, there was actually no space for 1 RCV contest on that same page. So one of the things that they did, and I'm going to give the Board of Election full credit for this idea, is they used the privacy sleeve, which I'm sorry is sadly shrunken, that is not obviously 100% size, to do better instructions using the language we developed for the Campaign Finance Board, adjusting it a little bit. So we actually got to sort of pilot this new language in a real election because they handed them a privacy sleeve with their ballot that had the instructions on it in shorter, clearer language. We're pretty sure no one actually looked at the block of text because when people see a big block of ink like that, they just think, oh, somebody dropped, some ants on this thing. They don't read it. And so the second block of language is actually the newly passed revision language in New York City. Everything we know about low literacy and low reading literacy tells us that the more you give people to read, the less they are likely to read it. And that the more you over explain, the more questions you raise in people's heads. And as everybody on the last panel said, RCV is actually pretty easy. You have some ideas about who you want, what order, just mark ballot. And anything more that you try to explain in that moment between here's your ballot and put it in the ballot box or put it back in the envelope to mail it back is just slowing voters down. If they want the nuance, have a place to have nuance, that's all great. But really, this is about instructions for marking the ballot, not instructions for learning everything there is to know about our choice voting and how you might possibly consider all the possible solutions, right? Which is what it ends up looking like. The words, so it was interesting because it's pretty clear they had one side was regular, vote for one, and the other was ranked choice voting. So they were both on the privacy sleeve, and it worked pretty well. We're gonna keep doing it. I think it was a great choice. Stuff in the ballot box is great. Stuff on the walls doesn't seem to work quite as well, except as a big alert, like, yes, there's ranked choice voting, don't forget. We did a test in Worcester where they were trying out cumulative voting or cumulative voting, and we sat people down and we gave them something to read, and then we sent them into the ballot, it was a lever machine at the time, with the things open so we could watch them. And we had people say, yes, I understand how it works. And they told us all about it. And they got into the machine and they pressed 1 and they walked out. And they went, and we'd say, what happened? They, oh my God, I forgot. In the literally 3 steps it took to get there, I'd forgotten. So I think something that if you're thinking about where that education, it's either be on the ballot or right around the ballot as people are marking, because that's the ecosystem, that last minute ecosystem. The other is don't cheat on the spacing. It just, first of all, you can, so this is a voting system technical thing, but if it's most paper ballots these days, this is slowly changing. There are those little black dots that go around the edge of the ballot. Those are actually functional. The intersection of 2 of those dots is where you can put a mark. And so everything has to line up on the timing marks. This is how you know that you're getting the whole ballot, and how they can go really fast. And so if you start to squeeze things, it doesn't work. So you have to think about stuff like how many ranks you're going to be allowed. you're gonna allow voters will depend on how much space you have. We don't think you can get more than 10 ranks across the ballot before you start to have to shrink everything. New York City managed to do 5 and 5 because 5 was their limit. They managed to fit it on half a ballot. But all of those things, what's in the law, when do they get to make the decision about ranking? But we were really proud that they managed to keep the text size larger than 10 point. Because there'd been a whole round of complaints about stuff that wasn't 10 points and wasn't readable. And that you can't abandon those things for RCV. So it's one of these big giant compromises, and the danger is that you end up with a camel and not, something gorgeous and beautiful. I'm trying to make sure that you're standing up for RCV, but also standing up for voters in general, and being willing to think about those things and just trying to set up a situation in which it's not serial attacks on the election official, each advocacy group coming in, but where everybody who's committed to running a good election gets together to help advise on that ballot.
Thank you, Wendy. I really appreciate that helpful handout, especially with thinking about design and getting to see that physical document. So thinking about the technical implementation process. So we learned a little bit about voting systems and a little bit of how to design our ballot. But now we've had our election. What does the counting and tabulation process look like? So Chris, can you walk us through what is the process to produce RCV results, and how does that differ from non-RCV contests? Or is it the same?
Yeah, so, you heard a bit about this in the last panel too, right? In Alaska, in New York, they were following all the pre-existing laws for ballot counting timelines, whether that was how ballots are getting counted at polling places or the timeline military and overseas voters have to return the ballots in Alaska. They have up to 15 days to get that ballot back because it takes a while to send mail from overseas. It also takes a while to send mail within Alaska. Or in New York, they have the somewhat delayed ballot processing timelines for mail-in ballots. Those facts will all differ depending on the state you're working in when you're implementing ranked choice voting. Plenty of states do have that ballot counting timeline, that ballot processing timeline that New York has for mail-in ballots. You can't start opening and processing ballots until election day. Other places like Minneapolis, which Aaron is going to talk about in a second, you have to have all mail-in ballots returned by the end of election day. So there's a ton of factors that aren't ranked choice voting, like people were saying on the last panel, that sort of get exposed because ranked choice voting is getting adopted, because we're thinking suddenly about all the systems and structures that feed into how we get election results. And ranked choice voting just highlights that because it's it itself is a system, it's a new structure for how our elections get conducted. So all of it gets put under a microscope. So there's plenty of things that can and do and will stay the same. I think it's one interesting layer too, not to make this answer too complicated, but if you're adopting locally, you have no power over what state law is on when ballots get counted and how ballots get counted. But if you're looking at a state level adoption, or if you're passing legislation, you can, before adoption, ideally take a look at what those timelines are and be like, are there things we can throw into our legislation that will ease this implementation process, that will make the ballot counting timeline a little simpler for voters to follow, make it easier potentially for administrators to do their jobs. So those are things I think to think about both pre-adoption, because a lot of the things we're thinking about in implementation are things, yes, we want to get right when we're implementing, but they're also lessons for the next adoption. So that being said, those are the things that can stay the same. The things that are different are two major things. One, you need the cast vote record data, the thing I was talking about before, that comes out of the voting systems. This has the ranking data for how every voter ranked every candidate on their ballot. You need that data to produce round by round ranked choice voting results. And to produce ranked choice voting results, you have to centralize that cast vote record data. You have to get it to a single location. In Alaska, that was Juneau, the state division of elections, got everything to Juneau from all four corners of the state. In New York City, that was at the City Board of Elections in Manhattan, where they were running those elections. And that, that depends on the jurisdiction where you're working in, where that centralization location is. But you need to get that cast vote record data to one location.
But it's data, not like Maine, where they actually ship the ballots.
Yeah, well, right. And that's the other thing is this can vary by jurisdiction. In Maine and in Alaska, there are plenty of places that still hand count ballots in the precincts on election day. Those places on election day, all they can report is first choice totals. They can't really, we can't make meaningful information out of second rankings, out of third rankings, if we hand counted ballots, because we don't know which of those ballots will transfer to another candidate if that candidate gets eliminated. So Maine and Alaska both had to centralize all these ballots from their hand count jurisdictions. In Maine, I don't remember the exact share. I want to say it's about 10% of their ballots. I'm not sure off the top of my head in Alaska, but they had to send those ballots to Augusta in Maine and scan those in after election day to get the data they needed to run their ranked choice voting round by round count. And that's something that I think is, you know, I can't say for certain that's going to happen in any state that adopts ranked choice voting statewide, but it's, I think, a good example of there's going to be there's always going to be some peculiar, unique local administrative practices that ranked choice voting is going to highlight that you need to either ideally anticipate upfront, but there's also stuff you're going to discover in the implementation process when you're getting ready to run ranked choice voting that you need to be ready to have a good creative solution for. And that's why we wanted to put a project like this together, because there's plenty of questions we know are going to come up every time, but there's always going to be unique stuff. And the better relationship you have with your election administrators, the better, more creative solutions you can find, whether that's coming from the administrators themselves or from you as advocates. You can bring lessons from other jurisdictions. Administrators can bring the practical realities of this is how we run elections. Here's a process we use in this other domain that we pull into ranked choice voting because they're working in a collaborative space. I feel like I've gone a little bit off topic, but all that to say, the things you need to produce ranked choice voting results, CASWIT record data, efficient centralization of that data, and then software that can actually produce the round by round count, which some vendors include in their system by nature. We have open source software called RCTab that's used in a few places, including New York, and will be used in Virginia. But that gets back to Aaron's point about certification and getting permission to be used in a jurisdiction. So those are the things that generally need to change and you need to be prepared for when you're producing ranked choice voting results.
Well, I can talk a little bit about our experience in Minnesota, really echoing what kind of Chris laid out there. First of all, all of our ballots have to be in on election night, which kind of takes out the whole question about are you running round results tabulations on election night and then every day subsequently. And so we can focus on getting all the ballots in, tabulated through the machines, and then beginning our ranked choice voting tabulation the day after election day. Now, it hasn't always been that quick in our history, as Jean mentioned earlier. In 2009, it was a hand count process that took 15 probably agonizing days for the candidates involved before results were announced. And that spurred some ordinance amendments for us in Minneapolis, which were implemented in 2013, and then a few others ahead of our 2017 election. That now we're at a point where we can confidently say and communicate to the public, candidates, the media, that will complete tabulation within the 24 hours after polls close on election night. And that's huge in terms of setting those expectations. And as long as we can meet those expectations, which we haven't, and something I would recommend, all the transparency and communication ahead of time that's been discussed is really important. But on the topic of kind of how things have changed for a local office, something to think about is that if you're adopting ranked choice voting at the local level, it may be an entirely new program, entirely new line of business for that jurisdiction. So our office, in years where we're not running ranked choice voting, our election night task is after all the results are transmitted from the precincts, and we've incorporated the absentee vote count, we put a link to the state site on our website, and then we just go home. And it is late, and we've worked a long day, but that's pretty much it. Because first choice, it's in a single choice election, you see those results, and the winner is pretty evident from that. So for ranked choice voting, that changes a little bit. So all of the in Minnesota, I'll just speak to all of the memory sticks where results are housed from all the precincts come back to us on election night. Maybe if we're lucky, most are in by about 10:30, 11 p.m. There's sometimes some stragglers who come a bit later. Then, while documenting chain of custody throughout the whole way, we transport those 100, in Minneapolis' case, 137 memory sticks to the county, who has the election reporting software. And overnight, the county is nice enough to read in those results to produce that cast vote record file. Then my team goes back at about 7:30, 8 a.m. the next day and hopes that everything is ready for us to pick up. Again, documenting this chain of custody so that we can bring it back, bring those cast vote records in, and then begin tabulation race by race, the mayor's race, and then down through our council, elected taxation board, and park board. So that's a whole new operation, and I think Whitney mentioned election administrators are really good at figuring things out and rising to the occasion and saying, this is what the law says, and we will complete that process. But it is daunting, and not just because it's new or different in the same way that voters have, but it really is this kind of, it's going to be an appropriation ask potentially. It's going to need you to have a good relationship with the county in our case, or maybe the state and other places where you really need to rely on people who didn't necessarily ask for your locality to adopt this voting system to work with you. And so that's just one example of how results are then communicated, because it takes that upfront effort to get it out in somewhat of a timely fashion that you can set the expectations for.
I do want to just quickly add, like, double down transparency, being really clear about your timeline and what that timeline is the most important thing. I think we've heard that on all the panels so far. Making sure as many people as possible know when they're going to know what information and what that information will solve a lot of problems up front. There's still going to be questions, there's still going to be frustration, especially if you don't have round by round results quickly, especially from certain national organizations. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is making sure administrators being transparent, that advocates again are amplifying that message. The other thing is you need to make sure you actually display these results in a usable, informative way, because this is a new process. It's a new type of information people are receiving. So you need to be able to teach people how to read the results because it's new. The most important thing people want to know is who won. Start with that. But then if people want to learn more, give them a good, useful, not too overwhelming set of information that takes them through the rounds of counting, shows them why what happened in the election happened in the way it did.
I would add something that we have not got anybody to do yet, but trusted really well, which is at the end, right? One of the promises is that of RCV is that we'll bring people together because people who voted for one candidate will end up having voted for another when they got eliminated. And too often the winner displays show these little ribbons with little tiny stripes of color, which is kind of meaningless to try to read. And so turning that into a chart that just for the winner shows how they accumulated votes round by round, who their votes came from, how many votes came from them, so that you can see where yours is. Because this is the moment when everybody now starts to want to know all about the geek grade, right? Let's talk about this stuff that nobody wanted to talk about beforehand when they just wanted to talk about how they're going to mark their ballot. Now they want to know things like, what happened, what if I skipped a rank, right? And so making sure that you've got a good cheat sheet on all of those little details of your ordinance or your law, so that you know how all those ballots are counted. You've got some good talking points for how to talk about it. Your press may or may not have done their research in advance, so somebody's going to need to help them make sure they understand all of that. And that an individual voter who maybe wants to know how the election came out, but what we found and what we keep hearing is that what they really want to know is how can they mentally visualize their own ballot's journey through this mess? And that's what we think the How the Winner one does. Because if you voted for candidate Z, who got eliminated in the 5th round, you can see that X% of Z's people voted for the next one. You can see your own ballot going maybe to R, and then it gets, you can see those transfers happen by following that chain up from the bottom. So thinking about the difference between what a candidate needs to know, what the press might need to know. They might be looking for an interesting story about how this ins and outs of the law of ranked choice voting produced this or didn't produce that. And the election office may be in a position to help them, but they may not. And so making sure that there's some voices that understand why the law ended up the way it ended up and what it does and doesn't do to voters.
if I can echo the last piece that you said in particular, in the same way that election administrators are stretched too thin, local journalism is on the rocks. And you can expect, especially at the local level, a lot of the reporters to be young guns in very high turnover positions. And so work really hard up front to establish relationships so that those reporters have somebody that they trust that they can go to, in who somebody they feel is in a neutral, reliable third-party organization, not a candidate, who can give them some of the spin on how did the logistics go? Because otherwise you're counting on somebody who may be, 24 years old and fresh out of school, sort of making it up as they go. Do that prep work up front, not in the rush of election night.
Right, teaser, we're working with RC and Fairvote on our next best practices guide, which would be like what the press needs to know, like what a press article needs to communicate to effectively communicate what happened in our city election. And we're learning lots of stuff. By testing some real articles, from real elections.
Yeah.
From some big outlets too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for walking through the kind of counting and tabulation process. And I think that really stresses how important it is to involve election administrators in all the different facets of the election early on. Because they'll think about things in different ways, from an advocate perspective to a legislator to an election administrator. And that can address some headaches before they become a headache, or at least help you solve them later on. So we've gone through the counting and tabulation process, and it looks like election night is going to be a nail biter. And so we're looking at a recount, and that's every election administrator's favorite thing to do. I say with a lot of sarcasm. So Aaron, Minneapolis had a couple of recounts for the ranked choice voting elections in recent years. Can you walk through what that process looked like?
Sure, and it's kind of a topic where I like to act like we don't like them, but then it is a little bit like a Super Bowl, we got to recount. All eyes on us, so on the nerdery side. It's kind of fun. So yes, Minneapolis had two recounts, one in 2017, one in recently in 2021. And the 2017 one I'll put to the side. It was relatively limited and only had to do with one round. It ended pretty quickly. And then in 2021, we were faced with a recount of a multi-round tabulation. It was the first one that we did on the day after election day, and the team of tabulators got to the end of the race. There was a 19 vote margin on about just under 10,000 ballots. It was nice to have RCV Resource Center's tabulation software, which we used as kind of a quality check and control, so we could plug it in and say, yep, it looks like it's a close one. So once that happened, and once it was clear that the runner-up candidate was going to request a recount, which they have the right to do for a publicly funded recount in Minnesota when it's within a certain margin. Our office kind of sprang into motion to figure out what the best procedures are. And like I alluded to earlier, in Minnesota right now, there aren't these types of state guidelines that take everything into account. So there's statute on recounts, but there's a lot of questions that come with a ranked choice ballot that aren't necessarily addressed. So it was, as chance would have it, I connected with the Resource Center, and Portland, Maine was also facing, I think theirs ended in a dead heat after the first tabulation.
The first ever ranked choice voting tie.
Yeah, and so getting some of the best practices from there and just deciding things like, are we recreating all of tabulation, or can we fast forward just to this final round where the margin is the closest? And then setting up the physical space. If you haven't been part of a recount before, there's kind of lots of to-dos and lawyers and observers, and it's a lot of focus. And you really need an orderly process to review the ballots and then dispose of them properly. So with that process, we kind of ramped it up and wrote some guides within a short period of time. It's nice to rely on things like voter intent guidelines that are either part of any ordinance law or are incorporated from state law, so that one of the fun parts about a recount is that you get to actually see all the creative ways that voters have marked their ballots, or all the creative names that they've chosen for write-in candidates. And examining those ballots, you'll note that not everybody votes by filling in the oval perfectly in the exact way that we all have in mind when we send out our voter education materials. And so training the team, running that process in kind of a orderly fashion. And then most importantly, we spent maybe half an hour to 45 minutes before, at the beginning of the recount, to walk through every step of the process, both campaigns present, their lawyers, the observers that were there, just to outline what was going to happen and all the questions that we had thought of, to let them know that we thought of this and we want you to ask us questions along the way. Here's how it's gonna look. Here's how you challenge our decision on a ballot. And that kind of lowered the temperature in what may have otherwise been a tense type of situation. And so the education piece, I think, was really great for those involved in the process. It was, the recount, the benefit is that you get to demonstrate that both the voting equipment and then our tabulation process is accurate, and as you get to see the ballots and uncover that. So we saw it as an opportunity. I wouldn't wish it on any other jurisdiction. We were happy it was in a council race and not a citywide race, of course. But it was a learning experience both for our office and then those involved.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that insight. And it was actually very helpful when we were writing the Research Center produced a recounts report. So Chris, can you talk a little bit about what we learned from other jurisdictions, what the other RC recounts, and are recounts just a part of the election process?
Yeah, so we did, because this recount happened, the Portland recount happened, and 4 other recounts happened in the same fall. We were like, we should probably learn what ranked choice voting recounts actually look like across the country. So Brian and I wrote this report, just trying to discover how many ranked choice voting recounts there had been. There have been 13. There's now 15. There were 2 in Alaska last cycle. And I think for me, one big thing I learned is that recounts are really complicated as a policy area. Like, they're a world unto themselves within elections, which itself is already a complex policy area that's unique to every single state. Recounts doubly true. So that was an interesting challenge in designing the report. Brian is familiar with this, of like, how much can we really actually understand about all the nuts and bolts of recounts in each state? And it was just a big challenge in terms of getting our heads wrapped around that. I think one other thing that was really interesting is that for a like a paper-based hand manual recount like Minneapolis does, I think generally, like, the painful part of a recount is the recount. It's not necessarily ranked choice voting that is painful. On the other hand, ranked choice voting will add time to your recount because there's more to do. You're not, especially if you're counting round by round, you're not just counting the votes in an election, you're counting rounds of election. And so your first round is going to take a while. You're going to have to figure out all the first choices. As you start eliminating candidates, if you're counting round by hand, the first few will probably be pretty quick. The first few candidates won't have a ton of votes, you'll transfer those ballots quickly. But as you get closer to the end of the election, those rounds might just take a little longer as you have to hand transfer every ballot. The interesting thing, though, to me, the upshot I have is in a machine recount, which is what a lot of jurisdictions do, where they're not actually manually processing ballots. All they're doing is scanning the ballots back through the machines and checking that second scan is the same as the first scan or close enough to the same. That's pretty much the same in ranked choice voting, right? If you have a voting system that can do ranked choice voting, your machine recount will be pretty quick too. I think there's a lot more in the report. It is 60 pages long. But those were the things that I remember sort of standing out to me, is like, recounts are hard. Ranked choice voting, like with so many things in elections, it adds another layer, but it itself isn't going to like break the system in half. It's just one more thing to think about. And the better prepared you are to run a ranked choice voting election, the better prepared you are to run a ranked choice voting account.
I'll just say the one behind the scenes note is that what really takes the time is that you have to open up all of the cases that have been sealed and verified seal numbers on all of the ballots, and then count those ballots in piles of 25 with 2 teams counting them, just to say the number of ballots that we expected are in this box are actually in this box. And before you even get to anything about looking what selections were made on any of the ballots, and that's just going to be the nature of a hand recount, looking at physical ballots.
Chris, have you started looking at procedural audits?
No.
Because that's the next one, right? Is how do you do a 1% audit of an RLA election?
Wait, do you mean tabulation audits or what do you mean in person?
Well, if you're only auditing a selection of the ballots, how do you? Right. Right. And you don't know on the first round. I mean, all you can do is audit the first round of that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, this is something that has sort of come up in Arlington. I know they're curious to do a risk limiting audit there. That's something we wrote a short report about as well, to try and capture the research into this, because there's been a couple pilots of risk limiting audits, but not like a fully fledged risk limiting audit program for Richards, right?
Versus a recount, which is usually 100% recount.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, that's something like there were a few places where we felt like there's just more policy development and research to be
Yeah,
done.
yeah.
And that's absolutely one of them.
So, before we pivot, after we have now walked you through what the technical implementation looks like, and we've had an election, I just want to remind you, if you have any audience Q&A questions, use the QR code on your table. But the last thing I want to do is ask each of our panelists, what are kind of 2 recommendations you would have for election administrators or advocates, thinking about some of the technical administration pieces of things, and we'll start with Sally in the middle, and then we'll go Chris, Aaron, and me.
So I think that in some ways, each of us up here represents one of the stars that has to align in order for you to have an opportunity to do ranked choice adoption. One of those is the piece that's already in place, which is we now have a well-developed national ecosystem of support organizations in the Center for Civic Design and the Ranked Choice Voting Research Center and all sorts of other partners that are here. So that piece is there for you when you need it. The second piece is the political support. And I think sometimes from advocates, we get the lion's share of the attention because you're thinking about, oh, how do I whip the votes to get this passed? But we are only a small part of it. We're one of the stars that has to align. But as Chris hit, you really have to think about your election systems sooner rather than later. So you know what are the communities that might be in a position to adopt early. And then I think we cannot overemphasize the importance of having an eager election administrator who wants to make it go well. And I think it's the alignment of all of those things that is allowing Arlington County to be the first adopter in Virginia, because they have a fantastic director of elections, the registrar, who is all in on the details, who wants to see it go really, really well. They have the election system that is best suited to do the first wave adoption. If you think about why hasn't Charlottesville City, where I serve, isn't doing the same thing, is because we're on a different voting system and the software is not quite there yet for us. There are other localities in Virginia where they've got the right voting system and they've got the local votes on their governing board, but the election administrator is kind of dragging their feet and the county board does not feel comfortable pushing that person because they're already under stress and have a lot on their plate. So you really need to have all of those things align and making sure that you line up each of them to know whether you've got a good adoption jurisdiction, I think is important. I think the thing that I would offer from my perch as advice about how you engage with election administrators is I remember hearing Vice President Kamala Harris speak once to a group of legislators directly and giving us some advice about what our role can be in any project. And she said, you really have 3 powers. You can legislate, you can author statute and try to pass it into law. You've got a bully pulpit, which I think you want your best legislative champions to use. Like I try to just be a walking fangirl for ranked choice voting wherever I go, because that's the thing that we have is we just get to walk into a lot of rooms and be excited about stuff, right? And help generate momentum. But the third that I don't think I really took as seriously as I should until I had other senior legislators sharing this kind of advice is that legislators, elected officials have the power to convene. We can schedule meetings and people have to show up. Like they can't say no to us. And that has been an indispensable part of getting voices like the Ranked Choice Voting Research Center and the Center for Civic Design in the room is, I was on the advocacy side of things. I was doing grassroots advocacy around ranked choice before I was elected. And I could write as many passionate emails to the State Board of Elections as I wanted and saying, you guys should really be talking to the RCD, but they didn't have to say yes. Now that I'm a sitting elected official, I can schedule a meeting with the State Board of Elections and then just invite Chris. And he gets to come because it's my meeting. And I think that that is a really important thing that you should ask of your elected champions is say, can you get me the meeting that I can't get on my own? Because I think it's an underutilized superpower of the people who hold elected offices is that other government officials kind of have to show up when we want to meet.
Man, do I have to follow with such a good? I think the best thing I can think of right now is one, like Sally said, make sure you have the voting systems you need to do ranked choice voting. Make sure you do have those stars that are going to align, because otherwise you're just not going to get off the ground. And I think honestly, the second thing is like just be ready to keep fighting after you win a measure. Like it really is, we say this in the introduction that Dave wrote to the guide, like this winning is step one. You have a whole, you should have ranked choice voting forever now. And there's gonna be a lot of work the first time, and there's gonna continue to be work ongoing after that to make sure that ranked choice voting stays and that it actually, and it improves that voters engage in it, that candidates engage in it, because people turn over, there's gonna be new people in your communities all the time. And you just need them to engage in your democracy, and that's why we are adopting ranked choice voting in the first place.
And thinking about this, working with election administrators directly, or if you want to ask them questions, we're going to think about very minute details, and sometimes it might be kind of, you're seeing the big picture or hung up on something really small about, maybe it's about layout issue or just how are we going to transport these memory sticks at this time, like does our key card get us into the building, and have patience because it's kind of just how we work, and working through that is the weeds at the beginning is going to make everything go smoothly, and kind of you have this, we talked about election day as you're kind of doing this event planning and hundreds potentially of locations and kind of make all the choreography come together, and that process starts months and years in advance. And so with some of the outreach and engagement might come in later, and just knowing that those conversations are happening at different timelines is important. The other thing I like to share, just thinking about working with voters, and something that I feel like I hear a lot or see with working with advocates is, I'd say most people in this room are very excited about voting and getting people involved to vote. And something that we see in working directly with voters is that just that interaction or showing up to vote can be a very emotional experience for voters, or it could be scary, or it's interacting with government and they've had bad experiences with government. And so doesn't matter if it's ranked choice or not, but anything that you do to make them less comfortable or make them feel silly or wrong or belittled or something like that is just going to have the negative experience. So with the ranked choice example is that we do see slightly more ballot errors because people are filling it out too quickly, or we have a multi-seat race, which some people interpret as vote for 3 at every ranking versus 1, 2, 3. And so we see a small uptick, not in people who aren't able to vote, but people who might need to replace their ballot with something new. And just, you know, we've thought through the process. We think we've given the right instructions. Just having grace and kind of accepting that and working with a voter, because we've seen it where if you say, like, oh, you made a mistake, now you can just have them shut down. Nothing else you say is going to matter. It's who's looking at me, what's the situation. And so just keeping that in mind with the messaging that we share and the experience of how we bring voters in. And, you know, usually we cheerfully replace the ballot, and if they keep making a mistake in that scenario, we have people who can help out. But I think that's just something I always want to share, because our passion for elections is not necessarily reflected, and it might have been a big deal for somebody to show up at all, that you want to reflect it in how you work with them.
So I want to borrow something from Washington State, because I haven't heard it mentioned. After the local choice bill passed at the state legislature, King County, which is the largest county, began convening a series of workshops for their office and invited all the rest of the election auditor's offices in Washington to join in, just working through the issues, just getting them ready for the local bills that were going to come. And it was great to be part of them, but you can also see as King County is beginning to think about implementing ranked choice voting now that it's passed in Seattle or in their county, I know in Seattle, sorry. Beginning to see how that's really paid off and they're knowing the questions they have knowing what decisions they have to make first and so on. So I think I don't know I'm pretty sure knowing Julie Wise that she came up with this on her own. She is very wise. But if your election office hasn't thought of that, sort of suggesting, it's sort of the flip side of yours, that suggests they can be people who can help them think through the issues and present it as thinking through the issues and make sure that it is. The second is whoever was in your coalition to get stuff passed, look at your community and look at that coalition and fill the gaps. Because it's one thing to get the bill passed, that's a legislative process. But if you're missing the language access people, the disability rights people, if you're missing all those folks who are on the fringes and most likely to experience barriers, you're not giving yourself a chance to see all the problems and fix them, let alone including everybody in the way that we want to do. And that leads me to my last one, which is test everything. Just test everything in some way, because I mean, my joke is I spent a lot of time in DMVs working on automatic voter registration, voter, and I walk up to people who are sitting in this long, dreary line and say, can I borrow 10 minutes of your time? So we're working these forms, and before the state prints a couple of million of them, we thought we'd ask the people to use them, and they go like, well, they actually do that? That's so cool. So not only are we learning a lot about the forms, we're sort of, little ambassadors of confidence that the office might actually know what it's doing.
Awesome. Well, I think those are all great pieces of advice. I'll just add one thing that, remember that this is a human process. We included in the guide that how to talk to election administrators, but like Sally said, we need all the stars to align. Remember that this is a human process. And as advocates, remember to be there, not just when you're asking for something, but offer to help, say thank you to your legislators, like just be kind, be good people. Like we all are here for the right reasons. We just want to move the movement forward. So I will turn it over to Alexi for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. So we have 4 questions. And to start, it definitely brings upon the last coming administration. Which jurisdictions are currently setting the standard for administration practices other than Minneapolis?
Thank you.
The first thought I have is I think New York's ballot design is amazing and Alaska's ballot design is great. Like they're both doing a lot of work New York is doing a ton of work to include multiple languages on the ballot. Like what you said, it has improved voter instructions now that they've simplified the language in the charter amendment. I also personally love the way this is extremely in the weeds, the way the certified results in New York look. I find them very readable. And I like that a lot.
It looked astonishingly, by the way, like a layout of the spreadsheet for Minneapolis, which is where we all started from. So let's just acknowledge that everything that comes out of the RCV tab was sort of based on some of that, and then our results display was based on being able to be something that that could be just a restyling of what comes out of RCV tab.
Aaron, are there any other best practices that you use that you reference from other jurisdictions?
Thank you for the shout out. Thank you for whoever wrote that question. But it is interesting in Minneapolis. We've had RCV for a long time. There's ways in which we felt like now others have stood on our shoulders and surpassed and exceeded in some ways from some of the limitations that I discussed that deal with ballot layout and things like that. I really like seeing the new ballot designs that kind of come through the different jurisdictions, and then just talk through different processes, because everybody has different issues that their community is focusing on, or advocates or opponents are kind of keying in on. And it's just really interesting. So I'll leave it there. That's not really an answer to your question, right? But,
That's
thank
Shout out to St. Louis Park, because that was a council adopted measure and the clerk really embraced it. And we had a student in our class who was her outreach person, and they used all of our assignments, our election design class to work on things, but they had a 12-month plan. And it was that every month there was going to be some touch, something that the city was already sending out. Plus all the usual outreach that they were doing and demo elections and stuff. But they, you know, they did fridge magnets, they took over an edition of the town newsletter, they put stuff into bills, right? So they did stuffers, and they just figured they were gonna start really quietly and gently, yes, it's coming. And it ramped up in complexity until the end, and it was consistent design. They sort of set the design early and they just kept building on it all the way through. And it's a beautiful piece of work. We've highlighted some of it on our website, but I bet they'd like to talk to you too.
And that does remind me that there are some really great explainer videos that have people ranking modes of transportation, parks, pizza toppings, as we've heard. And we have we're actually revamping ours in Minneapolis, which is now 10+ years old. And so it's time for that to be updated. And it's just great to send our communications team examples from Alaska and other places to say, here's the way to draw a really cute cartoon character with like googly eyes and things like that that I know people will love. So that's a best practice.
Yeah, I'll throw on there too. I think San Francisco does a great job with transparency around results reporting. And they are also a jurisdiction that does differ from places like Alaska and Maine, where Alaska and Maine are waiting for every single ballot to get scanned in before they produce round by round results. San Francisco is not doing that. What they're doing is immediately on election night, they're producing round by round results, just based essentially on the mail ballots they've counted so far on election night. And then they get precinct results and they throw those in later on election night. They update that day by day as more ballots get counted. And in California, 40–50% of the ballots might be cast by mail. So they have a ton of ballots they're still counting after election day. So even though they know they don't have every ballot counted on election night, they're producing that information and doing it in a really transparent and clear way.
To be clear, California processes ballots on receipt, but their return date is 7 days out, and then there's a cure period after that, so it's a long, elongated period.
We have another question.
Yes, we do. So this may be specifically for Aaron Whitney. Election administrators have conferences and associations. Is RCD discussed at these conferences? What part can you then play in building support for us?
Sure, there's meetings of election officials. So Minneapolis, we participate with the election center, which you may be familiar with, and often there's advocate groups, RCV Resource Center, Fair Vote. We're at a recent national conference, and I've now seen a few breakout sessions where ranked choice voting is highlighted. Oftentimes, as coming from Minnesota and Minneapolis specifically, after we get past the voting system question, it's what makes you unique. And so we talk about having same-day registration, which a number of administrators are just like, how would you ever do that? Because they're not familiar with it. And ranked choice voting is the same. And I have that reaction to how other states run their elections from time to time. And so those conversations are really great. It helps demystify things. You can exchange your contact info with people. I don't know exactly how I guess some people to my right would be better to talk about how advocates can infiltrate or attack that space. But those conversations are important to just make election administrators understand that it's possible, give them the confidence that they can figure it out and the resources on hand to make those connections.
Yeah, so you mentioned the national ones. I actually think for this, the states are much more important, right? Every state has at least one, if not two, and sometimes three associations that various levels of, so there's the cities, there's the counties, there's the election directors, the Secretary of State often convenes a law conference. So in California, there's CACO, which is the county election directors. There's the new law, which is the state conference in the spring. There's also NACO, which is National Association of Counties, right? So being able to talk to the different people and those things, and sometimes the election principal will be at several of them because they are the county clerk and they're also the registrar of voters. But thinking about all those different local things, it's actually an easier place to talk because you're only talking about one election system, right? And you don't have to do all the various ones, and they don't often have a lot of chance to see a national view, right? Because they're busy focusing on the stuff they do. So being able to be a little bit of a Johnny Appleseed and bringing in success stories is probably more exciting than yet another advocate talking to them.
And I would say, and forgive me if this is obvious, but I think it's always best to have an inside champion with their peers. By which I mean, if you're trying to get legislators on board or city councilors or county board members, get one who's all in and then get their guidance on how you bring their peers along. If you're trying to get registrars in your state on board, find the one who's all in and then ask them how you get their peers, because that's how trust happens in any group.
And typically you have to be invited. I mean, you can, in some of these places, you can show up. When we got started, before we actually founded CCD, we could go someplace and we'd stand there and be totally ignored, like we were just little invisible little people running through the building. And we just did that enough that people started asking who the heck we were and what we were doing there. But in the end, the program is set by the association itself, that is by the members. So somebody in that group has to think that this year is the year it would be important. Don't expect to get asked back the next year and the next year and the next year. It's not a permanent slot, because it's going to be whatever's top of mind for them. So the other thing that's really useful about going to these is don't just run and do your session and leave, right? Do the networking, but also sit in some of the sessions and hear what they're talking about.
Excellent answers. I think we have time for one last question.
Yeah, so say the pretty fun question for last. Do administrators have their own bakery parties after in combination, or do you do that with candidates?
I think they call it sleep.
Yeah. Nothing too wild, it's like, oh, we get to go home today and sleep. You know, sometimes there's a cheer that gets let out when you get the final results out there. Kind of boring, I think. I'm gonna have to think about that one. Definitely the happy hour the week after all of your election results are done is usually a pretty good one.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thank you to our panelists for all of your expert wisdom. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly for some of our closing remarks.
Just want to reiterate, Ryan, what Ryan said, that we are so appreciative of everyone attending today. It's good to see some friends out there that I don't get to see very often, and meet some folks I've only met on Zoom, and also meet some new friends. So we hope you found today informative. You got a lot out of it, and you know, we would love to hear your feedback on the report. We would love to hear what you thought about the event, so be sure to reach out to us. I did want to point out one more group of people that I did not mention earlier. We sent the report or parts of the report to about 50 people in our space, and just want to say how much we appreciate people taking the time to read the report, to give us feedback, to help us make it even more useful for you and your work. So thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. Now I'm actually standing between you and your glass of wine. So I'll invite you to stick around. We have some good, eats and delicious little appetizers, also some beer and wine. And we would love to, hang out and talk a little more because we've all kind of been running around. So it'd be nice for us to get to settle down and actually talk to you guys. So thank you so much for coming.
We didn't do anything like that. They have some, they're really excited to see them. There is no.
That wasn't sure.
I just, nobody actually screen read it and I'm the only staff now, so just.
I'm actually terrible at this and Chris is much better.
Okay, I'll ask Chris. He's not busy.
I didn't drink enough water during our panel and I'm worried I'm gonna lose my voice.
Okay.
I'm running home. I'll see you all in a little bit. One of them will grab you, but I'd say go to Chris.
So Wednesday, I heard people in the office the other day that I actually was stopping and working, but
Yeah.
And I'm sure that yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That they tell me for one thing.
Departments, I talked about this, like, if they're like, I'm looking for someone that's like not, it's director, not an intern, and someone who's like weird. Yeah, so, we said. One of the things I don't know how to do is like a meeting sometimes. Like someone can just. Yeah, I'm really interested, right? I also. I can do for me, or it's not like I couldn't do, I guess I would like them to be like, hey, you should be doing like. 3, 4, 7, 3, 4.
So this is our slide.
It's a good opportunity, you should be like, because I was giving you some file. You know, because Amanda's on here, so I was kind of getting.
Get it all done, yeah.
Yeah, or even just about like this, I mean, it's not that I I could talk to you. It's just, it's really interesting and I don't know about it. And it's whatever, and I'm like, oh, we should.
This is the. It's what we call our, this is like the normalization. Or if you encounter this, here's where you want that. You're making.
Okay.
You're gonna get
Yeah.
Just you have to look at that, this is the problem, like, somebody dropped it.
But this is why.
Yeah.
I
I see, down like that, because you were referring like, it seems.
I mean.
You can't. People.
See the number, right? There's no hours in the boxes. You can produce this now. Well, so we did the same thing, and we would not say that, but we did it in a. But you know. Years ago, it was just for testing, I thought, wow. But it does sort of. And I think that it helps, and I think it will help with that. And I think the loser doesn't matter what the loser then, right, it's the, it's part of the country, it's an office, and an office.
I mean.
Yeah.
A little bit, but not. Over, and that was something that they were gonna have.
I do like that.
And it's easy, it's just a case, right? I mean, it's a nice, it'd be nice if it was a nice thing. I mean, I love.
Next to the same.
I mean, I- Well, this was meant, if you look at it, it's the last right. So it's like you start with the winner.
Yeah.
And then.
Guys, that, okay. All right.
Deciding on. The simplest.
I always hate, when I'm not good at, writing letters, I don't verify all the facts myself.
So, yeah.
Stop this one.
First
because-
one. Yeah, that's all right.
I mean, problem is the board did their research and I don't for. So it's not like a letter from me as much as it's a letter from the organization, so
Yeah.
we're gonna let it go because I do not have time in the time frame that they want to send it out. Oh, is that still on? Let's
Just like. And this was like, it was so strong. I was like, I said, coffee.
We'll see what's the living things that they do.